on Discord, please. Good evening. Okay, come on. StreamYard open. Hello, gamers. I've got a sick wizard shirt. I'm just waiting to get put in. Um, I want to. Destiny is wrong about oligarchy. Or at the very least, his definition of oligarchy is just way too restrictive.
To asking the question, do you where low end theory and dialogue always would you say you see any kind of overreach happening?
Wait, Taftash is here now, by the way.
Oh, there we go. Hey, Taftaj, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much.
No
I'm
problem.
in.
Hey,
Success.
yeah. So, do you already know the topic of the situation that we're going through right now? Were you
The
listening?
current topic?
Yeah.
I don't know where we're at right now.
Really quickly, can you mute yourself on the StreamYard?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, so pretty much what's happening right here is we're talking about the 11 states. We're going to start in Florida that have legally passed legislation for changing pretty much the relationship between schools, the children, and the parents. Pretty much also it affects LGBTQ community because it is restricting curriculum that promotes LGBTQ things in the classroom. Is that a fair synopsis, everyone? Does that seem biased at all?
It seems all right to me.
All right, perfect. Right now, where we're at is trying to figure out this question that you can answer so we can see where we can peg you, Taftaj, which is, do you think when the label "Don't Say Gay" is slapped onto these bills, is that a fair label?
Yeah, I mean, sort of. I think that the bills are essentially they're regulating like how you introduce these topics of sex to children, and I think that it is like quite restrictive when it comes to how people are teaching specifically like queer sexuality. So that seems like it seems like a reasonable label.
Okay, so then that would put you with not actually with dialogue always or low end theory. That would actually put you hard on our first person that actually says yes, it's a fair label. So just so you know, I took notes of it. Fanatiq, Doobie, and Bretton-Box all think that it's a unfair mischaracterization of it in its entirety on its face. Low end theory and dialogue always are like they don't really know. They can see some problems that are happening when you label it that way. And then obviously I just said you're the only one that says hard yes, it's a fair characterization of the bill, which naturally leads us into I guess you could give the first take on it. Do you think the legislators were overreaching when they made this bill? Or do you think it was a common sense kind of thing going forward when they were writing this?
Since I just jumped in, I think that I'm going to like take a backseat for a second and just sort of, I don't know, get involved with where people are at first. So I don't want to come in like too hot. So I'm just going to take a backseat for like a little bit.
No, that's chill. So low end theory and dialogue always, I guess you guys could probably start it because I think you would say it is a little bit of overreach, right? Or would you say it's a little bit of common sense operating here on why this bill came forward? Or these
Well,
bills?
sorry. I guess I can
No,
just
you go
touch
ahead.
on. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go by all means, go ahead.
I think I can just touch on where I don't think, again, like I said, there's nothing in it that's overreach unless if you remove it from the climate of what's going on today, I don't see much that's an overreach. But if you add in the climate, there's a part in it that I do see as a problem. And it's, I guess, section part 7, 119, where it says each school district should adopt procedures for a parent to notify the principal or his or her designate regarding concerns under the paragraph at his or her student's school.
Is this the Florida bill?
Yes.
The Florida? Okay.
And the problem is if in the B section of that one, it says if a concern is not resolved by the school district, a parent may request the Commissioner of Education to appoint a special magistrate who is the member of the Florida bill or the Florida bar in good standing and who has at least 5 years in experience in administrative law. But further down, it says that the school has to pay for all of that. And that's where I find issue at, because if we were just in a normal climate, I can't see that as becoming a major issue. But since we're in today's climate, that could lead to something incredibly, or something that's not even that big of a deal at the end of the day, being taken by a parent through every single part of that chain, adding cost that the school has to pick up. So there's going to be an actual fear there of, okay, if I have to pay for this, if I say anything, can I even answer a question now? And see, that's where that's where I think the problem lies. It's more the climate than it is the law itself. The law itself, you really can't determine anything bad or good until you see how it's actually being used through the courts, because that's extremely expensive every single time to have to address a concerned parent that might actually have nothing but just wants to bring attention to something, which has happened a lot of times, especially, and we're starting to see it more and more when you get into the CRT
So you're
bills that are
saying,
coming out.
so you're not having a problem with. I guess what you're saying is that you just feel like it could be abused, and so then because it can
Yes,
be abused, it's a problem.
yes.
I mean, yeah, I think
and
that's
just
the rub, sort of, because the wording in the Florida bill is pretty vague. It's sort of just like if something seems wrong, the parent can like step in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then and yeah, I just think that ultimately you can decide I mean, truth be told, I mean, there are some schools that are going to be able to fight this, like, and some schools won't be able to. Like, poor school districts are not going to be able to fight something like this. So, like, what ends up happening? Do like these parents end up getting like huge like monetary like compensation for these types of things or something like that when they choose to sue the school over whatever the teacher may or may not have said? I think that can be that can end up causing a lot of like major issues. But then also touching on um, just the bill itself, it says it says specifically in the bill that you can't any talk about any type of like sexual orientation or anything like that. I don't think the bill specifically refers to LGBT, but I think it's like really implied. But then that brings up a really like weird, like a very like obvious question. Um, are they going to also like ban the teaching of like straight relationships?
Wait, the bill doesn't say that. The bill doesn't say that you can't talk about sexual orientation. It just says that you can't.
No,
it
it
just
does.
says it
But
definitely
it's only
does.
through grade 3 in the bill, which is
Yeah,
pretty reasonable.
Wait,
yeah,
where?
It's in
Yeah, it
page
does.
4. It says
yeah.
classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3, which personally I think is like fairly reasonable.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
again, like I started this discussion by saying it does seem like don't say gay because that's like literally true. But like the question then is whether that's appropriate to limit how schools are teaching sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think that's pretty reasonable. I think that we've seen over and over the state takes on more and more responsibility for the education, the moral education of people. And I think a lot of that is really the responsibility of families to decide what is appropriate for their children. So at least in this scenario, as far as like up to grade 3, I don't think that seems like a big issue. I do agree that like the sticking point is probably more with the vague language elsewhere regarding the ability of parents to step in.
Yeah,
Okay, so
absolutely.
it
Go
felt to
ahead.
me like that was more saying like instruction as opposed to, because the way I heard like someone respond and say something basically along the lines of like they're allowed to have discussions, they're allowed to like whatever, but the school's just not allowed to like design curriculum around it. Is that inaccurate?
No, I think
That's
Well,
that's
inaccurate.
it's
Yeah, the entire idea is that they don't want to allow teachers at any point to make any sort of comments towards gender identity, sexual orientation, or anything like that. It's just specifically, and that's why when it says don't say gay, I feel like that's fairly accurate. But at the same time, like depending on like how what's the word I'm looking for, petty a parent could be, it could end up not really being like a don't say gay bill. Does that make sense?
I mean,
that's two.
Aftosh
Here's
got
it.
cut off. Aftosh, do you want to step back in, say what you were about to say, or did he kind of like fill in what you
Oh,
were
I'm
going to
sorry, I
say?
didn't mean to cut you off if I did. I
no,
apologize.
I think you're good. We've moved on. But yeah, I mean, it is very specific as far as up to grade 3. Again, I think some of the problem was like the vagary of the bill, but the way that you could interpret this, and we'll have to see how it's interpreted through the courts, but I don't think it's that like you can never bring up sexual orientation. Like if you're teaching, for example, like World War II history and you talk about Alan Turing, it's not that you like can't mention that he's gay or like have a conversation about that. I think it's specifically like sexual orientation as like a health curriculum or something that is like
Right.
we're focusing on that.
All right,
Right.
Fanatiq, then Doobie. I saw your hand go up.
I'm just saying that was more what I was thinking was happening, where it's like it's not that you can't ever discuss sexuality. If there were like 2 gay students, well, in the third grade, that would be a little bit interesting. But like it's not like again, yeah, you could never discuss it. It seems like it's just that it can't be the curriculum. You can't like make this like this is our lesson or instruction plans. But like I mean, all the time in classrooms, I mean, everyone who's been through public education at all, I'm pretty sure we all recognize there were times where teachers would start sharing random stories about like their families or oh my son did this or my dog did this or what their trick or treat experience was like. There's all sorts of things that aren't part of curriculum that are allowed to be discussed by teachers. It's just that there can't be specifically instruction as it seems like it's coming from this bill, which I think is very distinct. So it's not like you just literally can't say the word gay. It seems like it's really you can't have gay curriculum.
Right. That's my interpretation as well. I think we're
Mhm.
on the same page there.
Doobie?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say exactly that, and so I guess I'll add that that I think that's why the "don't say gay" label is a mischaracterization, right? Because you
Only if you
can say
interpret it like hyper literally. But
no, well, but you'd have to like I think intentionally misinterpret the bill to get you cannot say the word gay. You can't say somebody's gay in the classroom because it specifically says instruction, right? So you're not going to have instruction about sexual identity or gender identity in the classroom, right? So if a story comes up, as Fanatiq just said, and they're talking about their gay friend or whatever, that seems like that isn't covered under this bill, that'd be totally fine.
yeah, I would say that like if we're interpreting like don't say gay in like a very literal or like encompassing way, then yeah, I would say that's not like applicable. It's only applicable when you're talking about like sexual orientation instructions through like health class or through curriculum.
But
Yeah,
I mean, the
right,
point of
soapbox
giving it
back.
the point of, sorry. Oh, thanks. But the point of giving it that title is that it's supposed to kind of obscure that fact. It's supposed to make it seem inflammatory and
Absolutely.
like, that's, yeah. It's not meant to illustrate that point.
I agree. I think that's part of the problem when we start getting into these conversations is because one, they all get crazily emotional, and two, we're not able to even have honest conversations about like the merits or the opinions of people. Instead, we end up spending a great deal trying to talk people away from things that they don't have any idea about. Most people aren't going to read the bill; they're just going to read these mischaracterizations. When I was like trying to look up the bills, it was insane to me. All of these different places, NPR, Associated Press, all these different places had all of these articles talking about the bill, and not a single one of those articles actually linked the bill. I had to look and try to figure out, okay, what are they saying is the bill? And then, like at one point, they said it's the parental rights and freedom. So it was like, oh, that's then it was like, okay, now I know what the bill is actually titled. I have to do a separate search for the actual title of the bill in order to get access to the bill, because the same articles all talking about it aren't even mentioning the bill. So people are becoming informed by the news sources that they trust while not actually understanding at all what's being talked about. Like it's so then you can't have conversations about it.
And at the same time, I had the same experience as Fanatic, and I think, and I noticed in a lot of these articles that interviews with trans activists or allies or whatever, talking about how the legislature was trying to erase their existence, right? And I don't think it's reasonable to say that not allowing instruction on these two topics from K through third grade is erasing their existence or not allowing them to be spoken of at all. So I think the combination of the narrative that seems to be pushed in just the label "don't say gay," right? This title, in addition to the kind of narrative they're crafting by having all these activists and whatnot, further mischaracterize what's in the bill in the stories, right? With like sob stories. I think just points to this being like another case of like media malpractice.
All right.
Malpractice
So
is absolutely right.
Yep. I like that.
So I think that is a good point. This is good because we're defining the terms and seeing really specifying the language. So I want to see if dialogue always and low end theory. Do you guys see how the vagueness without this type of conversation happening and actually looking at the bill and reading it? Like, do you guys still feel that it's vague, or is it getting more specific to you?
Well, I mean, again, like I said, the part that I have the biggest issue with is first off, when we say instruction, that we've already shown in multiple states on different subjects that instruction doesn't just mean lesson plans, doesn't just mean syllabuses. Instructions also can lean on just a teacher talking to a class about something. And when we get into a climate that we are in currently, and that's why I keep having to reiterate, um, the climate that we are in definitely matters. Because if a teacher takes it upon herself to explain maybe a same-sex couple how they function, like not like the sex portion of it, but like, hey, these are two men, they care about each other, just because they were asked about that, and that gets taken to a parent as, hey, my teacher told me two men love each other, and that parent already having maybe their religious or, I guess, antithetical beliefs towards homosexuality, they can address the school saying, hey, I have a concern. And that school has to go through that entire process to address that parent's concern. So that is hundreds, if not thousands of dollars before we possibly could get to the answer of, oh, no, maybe this wasn't as big of a deal. Now, if you multiply that by 30, 100, 200, 1,000 different times from people who have definitely shown they have a motivation to get rid of public schooling in general and enter privatized schooling, you start noticing that that can definitely be used to damage schools, to hamper schools. So that's the issue that a lot of people that are saying don't say gay are starting to push onto. Like, granted, yes, almost every issue that involves homosexuality are going to have extremists saying something way over the top, granted. But the real fear here is addressing so many straw cases of things that end up being nonsense that a school could actually lose their budget.
Oh,
I can
and
understand.
I'm just
Go ahead.
And I'm just going to touch on this really, really quickly. The bill makes no mention of talking about it in a specific curriculum, whether it be like a health curriculum or anything like that. It only speaks about discussions in general on the bill itself, which is the reason why I also said that it was very vague. So
It says
discussion could
instructions, not
literally.
discussion.
It uses the word instruction, yeah, which I agree, like, could encompass a lot of things.
So
So it would be
So,
nice to
I'm-
have that defined.
I'm gonna read it verbatim just because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. With excuse me, critical decisions, blah 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 blah.
page are you on?
Prohibiting classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels or in a specified manner. So again, it doesn't say anything about instruction. It says specifically just discussion.
Oh, we're
So,
looking at
I mean,
different places.
Where were you reading
I'm
that?
looking at the exact bill itself.
Yeah,
We're also
it
looking
also
at the
says
bill. Where
instruction
in
in
the
a
bill are
different
you reading?
place.
Where are you reading?
Bottom of the first page. Right
There's
below.
lines next to everything. What you
Oh,
looking
okay.
at?
I see. It will be line 21 and down.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Prohibiting classroom discussion about
Discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity.
In certain grade levels or in a specified manner.
Well, of course. So we've already specified that it's going to be K through third grade, which again, like, I don't really know if there's like any such thing as like a sexual orientation class in third grade, but
Yep.
besides all of that,
I mean, the other thing is
this-
that it says like in a specified manner, and elsewhere, when it gets down to where it elaborates, it says in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate. So,
well, who decides what's not developmentally appropriate or what's not age appropriate? You know, like
And
if literally someone just saying that gay people exist, somebody could say, "Oh, that's not age appropriate," which reason why again I lean towards it being a vague law, or even like maybe something as simple as like in history class, like what if a teacher wants to talk about the Stonewall riots or something like that? You know, that's something that's clearly like a gay focused historical event, LGBT focused event. Like, who's to say that that's not appropriate, right? We don't know what
And
I mean, are
That's-
third
and seven-
graders or second
and
graders or
73
first graders really needed to learn about like Stonewall riots? Probably not.
I'm not saying
right?
that they need to. I'm just saying that like I'm just giving it like a specific context where this is an LGBT focused event that has nothing to do with a health class, right? This just could just be something that maybe the teacher like wants to talk about because they think that's important. I think that when we're talking about like school as a whole, like I do understand that like it's not the school's job to teach like certain things, but I know school is also where we learn important like social skills, and I think it's important for you to be a well-rounded person growing up because while I don't know if like third graders are conscious of like who they're like or what their particular like preferences are, I think if I can remember, I think I was into girls when I was in third grade. Like I was noticing them in third grade, but and I think that's maybe even a point where some people start going through puberty as well. When do you decide like if like learning about XYZ is appropriate And also who decides what is the appropriate time to learn about these things and end up like, turning out to be a well-rounded person when you're in school. Go ahead.
Before we get there, let's
Mhm.
this discussion versus instruction portion. So you understand at the very beginning of the bill, like the whole purpose is like to kind of paraphrase what the ideas are to be expressed. But then when they go into the actual implementation, the things that you would present to court is not the abstract of what the bill is, or like the general consensus or the general framing of what the bill is about. You would have to be citing specific things, and the specific things you would be would be where everything after it says, be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Florida, and then it goes into the specificity. And from that point on, it uses the word instruction and not discussion.
Could you point out that line for me, please?
It's line
Uh,
97.
yeah.
97. Thank you.
And the one that says
To be-
enacted by this legislature is at line 59, because everything up to that point is like a paraphrase, and then they go into the specificity of how this thing is being implemented and what the actual law is. And so everything that's in the actual law after 59, it uses the word instruction and not discussion.
Does this bill define instruction at all?
No.
Really quick,
No.
let Doobie get in. Doobie, what did you want to say?
Well, really quickly to that. So it doesn't define instruction, but when this has been discussed on the floor, it's been said repeatedly. They're talking about lesson plans, curriculum, things like that, right? So they're not talking about, just classroom discussions that about pop up. So I was gonna kind of hit on that, but also I think that if there's like a concern that there, because of even this thing you just pointed out, right, that it uses discussion at the start and you need to read further and to find the details where it says instruction, right? Even that concern, right, the concern there seems to be that teachers will think they're not allowed to discuss sexual identity or gender orientation, or sexuality in general, with K through third graders. That's something I probably don't want teachers to be discussing with those kids anyway. These are like 8 and 9-year-olds we're talking about, right? It seems like that's a discussion that should be put off until they're a little bit older, right? And that seems totally reasonable. So even if there is some concern there with this being vague, that concern seems to be that a thing might happen that also seems reasonable.
Yeah, and so I think the other thing to understand here is that if you're a parent who really believes that students need to have education on sexual orientation and gender identity, you can still, talk to your children about that. The law doesn't like prevent families from going to their children and, understanding, really sitting down with their kid and, having a conversation and making sure they understand it in a well-rounded way. The only thing that it's preventing or creating, properly a chilling effect, either through outright prohibition, as we see in like, starting at like line 97, but also above when it's talking about, making sure that parents have like, they understand what the curriculum is going to be, and they can like sort of go to the principal and negotiate that. I think it's only sort of preventing the state from engaging in that kind of education, which I think is probably appropriate.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that they're just setting standards for when they want to begin like discussing sexual issues with people below 18, like people within their care, their students, their minors. And I don't know, I think third grade is a reasonable place to start.
Yeah, and yeah.
Go ahead.
No worries. That kind of sends us more forward now because we're talking about strengthening the language of the bill. Obviously, because somebody might detect there may be some kind of moral positive or negative implication here. Low in theory dialogue, always. I think you guys are going to have the, yes, this is morally wrong because, and then I leave that to you.
Do I think it's morally wrong? I mean, I guess there's some ways that I say it could be. Like I would have no problem with this bill overall if it specifically specified what instruction means. If they're just talking about like no sex ed before third grade, I'm like, okay, cool, like fine, whatever. But it just doesn't. The language of the law doesn't seem to say that at all. And again, like I could be swayed assuming that like if someone eventually, because I mean, if if I remember correctly, this law is like it's been signed. Has it been signed by the governor already, or I can't actually remember if it was or not.
It hasn't been
But
signed yet, but it's on its
it
way.
hasn't been. Okay, cool. So assuming that this was signed, and then when it goes into effect, which I think is in July, and then like I don't know, like some parent brings up like a super frivolous lawsuit, and ends up winning, based on like a customer making like a vague remark about someone being gay, or it's like some historical figure, or whatever the case may be, and it has nothing to do with like a healthcare instruction, and that parent ends up winning that lawsuit, then I would have an extreme issue with it. Now, if we're just talking about just no sex ed, cool, whatever. That's absolutely fine. And honestly, at that point, I would feel like the bill is almost meaningless because I don't even know if sex ed before third grade is even a common thing.
Well, the other important thing to notice is that it specifies in an inappropriate way. So, it, I think what you're getting at is that, like, however the bill's worded, it's worded in such a way that it might have a chilling effect on the conversations and the discussions, the free speech within, schools. And so I think you might make the argument that, like, even if the bill doesn't explicitly forbid legitimate, productive conversations about specific historical gay figures, something like that, there might be teachers who feel uncomfortable adding that to the curriculum, just because of the bill as it exists and like the fear of being sued, which is of course like money, even if like it doesn't go anywhere, even if the the lawsuit is like filed in their favor, there's a lot of headache with that. So I think you might make the argument that like there is a chilling effect, even if the bill doesn't explicitly forbid, for example, mentioning Alan Turing, that sort of thing.
So if I could go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so to paraphrase it, it seems like you're basically just saying, like, the bill on its face is not terrible, but there could, because of the fact that it's somewhat vague, some people might use this bill in the worst kind of way, and if those specific things happen, then it would be a problem. But if we're charitable to the bill, then you have no problem with it, low in theory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because honestly, I feel like the bill is just kind of useless, and then at that point, then I just feel like it's just like what's sort of look for, like a rally cry for the Republican base. And
I don't know about useless. So we've seen. Look at all of the other states like California and California. That's the state. We should start there. Look at the fact that California literally started putting legislation, like passed legislation, in which they were teaching young children in kindergarten, and it was part of the curriculum to ensure that children could understand the difference between gender identity and sex by the time they were in the first grade. Like if this was what they were instructing the schools to do.
I understand that, but at the
So
same
you can
time,
see this response.
A law passing in California doesn't affect the law, the school curriculum in Florida.
Absolutely. However, but my point being that if we've passed, and it wasn't, California's not the only state to do that. And so if we see various states starting to do this, then I think it's reasonable to then say, well, you know what, since states are doing this, for Florida to take it upon themselves to say, okay, we're going to nip this in the bud and make sure that this is not happening.
But they're preemptively trying to stop something that I would assume is not an issue in Florida. I don't even think that there is a possibility that something like that would even pass in Florida.
Do you think there are no blue regions?
I mean, yeah.
In Florida.
Yeah,
do you think?
Do
you think it could happen in a blue region in Florida?
But the governor is the one that's putting is the one that's.
Fanatic, are you talking about California Bill 179?
I'm not sure. I don't remember the name of the bill, but I just remember that was a big thing. And then there was a textbook that came out, and all the parents got a hold of it, and then they had to retract and say, no, we're not using this textbook because it was absolutely horrendous. Just all of that stuff. But if need be, I can, while you guys continue the conversation, I can try to look it up.
Were they using the textbook though?
No, luckily parents caught it before they were able to, but that was the intention. They were
trying to institute it.
Absolutely, and then they prevented it.
Okay.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Going back, I'd like to address something Doobie said earlier. When you said that they were talking on the Senate floor and they definitely defined what instruction meant, I think that's the biggest point that I'm trying to make. If you, regardless of whether or not something's defined on the Senate floor, we've seen this multiple times where something can be clearly defined on the Senate floor, something can be clearly defined in the draft of the bills, and then the bill becomes vaguer and vaguer and more vague, more vague, more vague until it gets to the
Mm-hmm.
governor's desk. And see, that's my biggest issue with the fact that they did not specify one, what instruction meant, and two, what I have a bigger issue with is they did not explain what what resolved technically would be.
What
And
resolved
see, the
technically would
problem
be?
is if you don't, if a school doesn't, it says if the issue is not resolved, then it goes through the process of the school magistrate and then eventually goes to the courts. So it says it has to be resolved in a certain amount of time. But since it did not explain that instruction is syllabus or lesson plan or anything else, how do you resolve an issue when it is so vague on what exactly instruction is supposed to be? So if we can't even declare in 7 days whether or not something is instructed, how can a school resolve it before taking the next step of a school magistrate?
It's interesting. So I agree this has been a problem historically, I'm sure. But even with this bill, there was an issue when I was trying to find this bill. When I was scrambling through all these articles, trying to figure out what this bill was actually called so that I can read it. I ended up finding an older version of the bill. I think it was the Senate version, um, which had different language, right? And for like a good 2 hours, I was struggling to figure out what primary grade levels meant in Florida, right? And because that was those are the words used. They're prohibiting this instruction in the primary grade levels, and I couldn't fucking find this anywhere. It was very difficult for me to find this. Um, and so then eventually I found an article that was bringing up exactly this. It's Florida didn't the Department of Education actually didn't have a statute that laid out what the primary grade levels were specifically in Florida, right? So this is why you had people running around saying that this was K through 12, right? That they were going to be prohibiting this kind of education because they were saying,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
yeah, because there was some in Florida. The primary grade levels are K through 12, so we're restricting it all through high school. So they had to revise the bill again and specifically put in kindergarten through grade 3. So there have been issues with the language in this bill, with it being vague, and it seems like rather than it becoming more vague as the process has gone on, it's become more specific, right? Which is why initially it said discussion, and the word instruction wasn't in there. It was prohibiting discussion. Now they're saying specifically instruction of these things. So it seems like the trend is actually reversed, right? So they're becoming more specific as the bill's been going through the process.
Yeah, and it'll
Well,
also get
that
more specific as it goes through the courts and there's case law that develops.
And that was my point, right? Is like I will be okay with this as long as like there's no case law that comes out further down the line. I did want to ask you, Doobie, really quick. What do you mean by there was no statute within the Department of Education? Is that what you said? That specified what
the primary grade levels were. Right,
yeah,
so
like that wouldn't be the Department of Education's jobs. It's the legislator's job to define what those things mean because it's the letter of the law. So when we're talking about like who gets to decide what is defined as the primary grade levels, that's not their job. So what I would look for in a bill, if it's best to be as specific as possible, is for them to define what they mean in the language that they're using, because there's no definition of instruction within the bill itself. It leaves a big open blind spot to possibility of very like litigious people looking for a way to make a quick buck against a district that maybe can't afford to deal with a lawsuit that comes from like a teacher like vaguely mentioning like some sort of like gay issue or mentioning that someone is gay, whatever the case may be. But then even then, it doesn't even just extend to just like gay trans ideology. It even extends to like straight ideology, and that's where that becomes a huge blind spot in and of itself, right? Like why would what would stop, I don't know, like a crazy parent from saying, like, I don't know, you read this, I don't know, you showed this movie, or you talked about Romeo and Juliet, like something really, really, really dumb that could end up, causing huge like legal repercussions to that school. You understand what I'm saying?
And Doobie, I understand what you were trying to say, but that didn't exactly answer my question.
Well,
If
dialogue, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think I don't want to hang us here on the whole conversation because I think we can all say roundabout, we just need more stronger specific language, correct? Everybody would agree with that?
It would help.
I mean, that would,
It would help extremely. Yeah, it would nip this conversation in the bud right away.
Perfect, because we can move on to something that was not vague at all, and that's Idaho's legislation. Did you all read that one?
Yeah, that one's
I read
pretty
that one.
specific.
They were not messing around at all. They did not want to leave any room for this kind. What happened in that previous hour we just went through? They said, no, I don't want any of that. Put it down on the table right there. So,
Right.
who is for or against Idaho's bill? Or raise your hand. Okay, I got. Can't see Fanatic. Your hands up, and then Brimbox. Doobie, is it interesting? I didn't think Doobie's hand would not be up on that one. That's interesting. Okay.
Actually, I hadn't read Idaho's bill, so I don't have an opinion on
yeah,
it.
me either. That's why.
I could just give a really brief summary
go for
of the bill, just really quickly. Essentially, the Idaho bill is essentially saying that you're not allowed to have what trans people call bottom surgery below the age of 18.
It's also saying you can't delay or suppress puberty. You can't have any sort of trans surgeries.
I didn't see that part.
It
Yeah.
I didn't
says
see
this.
that part at all.
It
Yeah.
says this specifically. It says this cannot happen to confirm someone's sexual identity if it differs from their biological sex. That's what it says. It doesn't use the word gender. It says sex. So it's saying if someone thinks they're a male or a female, but they're biologically male or female, you cannot do a surgery to alter their genitals or stunt or disable their reproductive system.
It also says performing mastectomy, which is breast removal. It also says administering or supplying the following medications, and it lists puberty blocking medication, testosterone or estrogen. So
And
it
it
also
says-
blocks all
go ahead.
hormones.
It says in pursuit of like affirming a self-identified sexual identity. Like
Yeah, it also specifies that like
mention that.
if someone's intersex and the surgery is like intending to correct ambiguous genitals, then you can provide this sorts of surgery.
yeah,
And
Doobie,
it also
vague
provides
at
a
all?
provision. Oh, go ahead.
Doobie, is this vague at all, or are you going to put your hand up yet?
I could also link it. I don't know if it already got linked.
I'm actually reading it right now.
Okay.
Okay.
So
It
It's
also-
pretty short. It's only like 2
Yeah,
pages.
it's
is
only 2
short.
pages, and they also mentioned specifically that you would be in the cases like because puberty blockers were originally instituted for children who like had early puberty because like there's been cases of children actually going through puberty in 1st and 2nd grade. It's incredibly rare, but those happen, and so they wanted to delay puberty in those instances, and so they made it so that's what puberty blockers do, and so for medical reasons like that, you're allowed to still go forward with anything. None of these things impact or affect like traditional medical science or medical intervention. It only affects specifically giving people these interventions for the purpose of helping them to transition.
Then, so I'm reading it through it, but based on everything you guys have said, I think I'd be in favor of it.
There you go, Doobie. Thank you. We didn't need that long. I knew you'd be on board. So, all right. Obviously, it looks like the whole right side of the panel is in disagreement. Left side of the panel is in agreement. Can we all, for a second, just ask ourselves what are the moral implications of this bill? And I'll let the right side of the panel go first.
Yeah, I mean, I could start. There are countless studies which affirm the positive psychological effects of providing hormone therapy to people with gender identity disorder who are young, who are below 18. So in the interest of like treating this psychological problem, you treat it with drugs like you treat many other psychological problems. it's proven to have a positive effect. So, I mean, the medical literature is like pretty clear on what is the effective going forth here, and we don't see like big problems with that as long as gatekeepers exist to make sure that people genuinely have gender identity disorder and are genuinely suffering from this, then we know what works to fix these sorts of things. I think that it's very frustrating to me that this has become a political or like culture war issue, because it really shouldn't be. The amount of people who have gender identity disorder, it's a tiny fraction of the population, and it shouldn't be something that is even like public debate. It should be something that is dealt with privately between doctor and person and doesn't involve the rest of society. So I think that this is sort of like, there's a reaction right now to a social movement that is happening, and I think that the social movement has a lot of problems, but when it comes to the actual like prescription of hormones in a medically verifiably effective way, I think that that's something that should continue. And this blocks like the medically effective prescription of hormones, but doesn't actually address like the social movement, which is actually the problematic thing here. So I think it's like a complete disaster if you are a conservative person who is wanting to push back on, the trans rights activist agenda or gender abolitionism or so on. I think if that's your goal, this is like totally not the way to do it. This is like punishing people who are just trying to treat a psychological issue.
Right. Let's go with Brento Box. What would you say in response?
I would say like this debate comes down to the entire debate, and what it's ultimately about, like in this contention, is the meaning of the words we use to describe reality. And it's about the meaning of male and female and its purpose and its like place in society. And this bill, I think, is seeking to affirm that the sexual reproduction and I think like even something as simple as puberty, and you might say, oh, it's not simple, but sexual reproduction, puberty, male and female, and its place in human beings and human society is what's ultimately being debated. And I think that's a little shocking. I think it's kind of shocking to a lot of people because that feels like it's something that's as necessary as like the understanding of what like oxygen is and what food is. And so when these types of things are coming up and people are saying, well, we might need to affirm someone's gender identity, even if it, prevents them from going through puberty or it sterilizes them. Gender identity is more important than biological sex. Those types of things, I think, make people feel like they're almost like attacks on society and health.
I love that you're saying this, because I think you're getting to like the exact problem that I have with the bill, is that like the idea that we prescribe people hormones doesn't say anything about like whether you believe or don't believe that someone is like the actual gender that they believe they are, right? So like I agree that like the problem with a lot of trans activism and like the gender abolitionist movement is that it like demands people verify and like buy into the gender identity.
Yes.
But like just prescribing someone hormones, like you don't have to buy into the gender identity of that person at all. You just have to recognize that like if you give someone estrogen, they're a little bit happier and like more capable in society. And there's lots of drugs that like have negative effects on like your fertility, but we think are good because ultimately they improve people's mental well-being. They allow them to live happier and successful
Not
lives.
with children.
Yeah, with children, for example, SSRIs. And like, yeah, so, and we can like think of lots of drugs like this. And so I don't think that like the primary goal of anyone in like the medical field is to make sure that they're capable of having children. Yeah, I think that's like a completely absurd proposition.
It's that, I mean, it's an absurd proposition that to say that inducing a sterility is not a solution to a mental identification. If someone identifies a certain way, inducing sterility in them is not an issue.
No, okay, again, because like identity is not what we're debating here. We're talking about gender identity disorder or dysphoria, which does not necessarily have to do with the identification, right? If I just identify as like a
how's it
man,
not?
because there's a distinction between people who are transgender and people who have gender identity disorder. Not all trans people have dysphoria or a gender identity disorder. And, that's an important thing to recognize, because you can have trans people that don't need to medically transition. And what we're really talking about is this psychological problem that we have a treatment for. And that is not necessarily, being able to prescribe them hormones is not necessarily an admission that you agree that they are a man or a woman, depending on what they claim. It's just an admission.
I'm sorry, pause really
Yeah.
quick. I want to get more people in here.
Sure.
I'm going to do it with this question because I think we need to back up a little bit and define terms. And I'll try and give it to Fanatiq, see if he can answer this question. That'll probably help us. What is the purpose for puberty blockers in a adolescent being given to him?
Well, that's what I was just about to ask, because I feel like I don't know how we get past that point. Again, there's the purpose of giving it to like prepubescent kids and things like that who are going through puberty, specifically to prevent them from going through puberty. Like that's like the medical intervention reason. And then the other reason is because the child feels like for every way I've ever heard, it's specifically because of a person that like thinks that they want to transition possibly at some other point in time, and that we know and so then the puberty blockers to prevent them from going through puberty as the one sex, so that way it to sort of ease the transition process. That to my knowledge, that's it. Tough touch. To me, the idea of divorcing puberty blockers from gender identity seems kind of crazy to me. I would assume, and tell me if I'm wrong here, that 95% of times, outside of this medical intervention point that we're talking about, the people who would be receiving puberty blockers, like 95% of the time, this is specifically going to be related to dysphoria or some sort of transgender person. Is that fair to say? Or let's ask this question really simply. Do you think outside of medical intervention, there are any non-trans people who are getting puberty blockers?
Yeah, I mean, so this does happen, and it's a problem, right? So like if someone doesn't have gender identity disorder and they begin, for example, testosterone therapy, and their voice deepens and they develop facial hair, let's say that they are someone who is, assigned sex female at birth, and that person is given testosterone and they don't actually have gender identity disorder. They get older, they realize this is a mistake, and now they're left with all of these effects of testosterone. That's a bad result, right? And so I think
that's not an answer to my question, though.
So the answer is yes, that does happen, and it's not good, right?
Which like is the thing you were providing to me, was that supposed to be an example?
Yeah, that happens.
So in this example you're talking about, it's a person that specifically was taking testosterone. Why?
Because they were able to get a doctor to prescribe it. They could get it prescribed for many reasons.
Why did they get this?
What?
Why did they get the doctor to prescribe it?
Probably because they said, I identify as transgender.
Okay, boom. All right. So we're gonna
Yeah.
stop there, because
Yeah.
remember, the thing that I was specifically asking you was, were these things happening specifically to trans people? Now, I guess maybe I should broaden it, because I realize now that I left a hole there. People who are trans or believe they are trans. So what I'm saying is you cannot divorce puberty blockers from the trans experience or the perceived trans experience aside from the medical intervention. Is that fair to say?
I mean, I wish this were like true, because it would make the conversation way easier. But like the unfortunate reality is that there's a lot of people who identify as trans, but in fact don't have dysphoria, and so
Sure. But
yeah.
but you still mentioned the trans thing. So my point, it seems like you're having a hard time agreeing with this, and it seems like every time you're trying to argue, you're
Okay.
making a statement that is in line with it.
Okay.
I'm saying puberty blocker only associated with trans experience. Perceived trans experience is still associated with trans experience. Actual trans experience is still associated with trans experience. Dysphoria because of trans experience, which is not always because of trans experience, or not always coinciding with trans experience, but dysphoria because of trans experience is still related to the trans experience. These are all three different reasons in which someone would be receiving these puberty blockers.
Mhm.
Can you show me any example outside of that scope in which the trans experience, be it perceived or actually experienced, or dysphoria perceived or actually experienced as associated with transness? Can you give me any other example ever besides medical intervention in which these puberty blockers are given?
So
Sabotage, really quick. Heat
Yeah.
off of you. Heat off of you. Low end theory, dialogue always. Can you help her or help Sabotage answer that question?
no, I mean, I think what
She
Fanatic's
can answer.
asking is just that, like, can I think of an example of someone given these puberty blockers who has nothing to do with trans stuff, right? So they're not trans, they don't think they're trans, right? Like that sort of thing is what you're asking. Yeah, and thank you for clarifying, because I think I just interpreted your question a little bit. I was interpreting it a different way at first, but no, I think that like these things, you know, as long as we're not talking about like delaying puberty for someone who just has like a developmental disorder, outside of those two things, trans things and, you know, a developmental disorder, I can't think of a reason why someone would be prescribed these sorts of hormones.
So then you cannot divorce the transness or gender identity from puberty blockers then, if that's fair.
No, I mean, because like medically speaking, hormones are not given to someone just because they identify as being trans. At least to do that would be medical malpractice. You're supposed to
Sure.
give hormones to someone who has gender identity dysphoria or gender identity disorder, right?
Right.
So I think that like in practice, most of these people are trans, but like no, you shouldn't be giving hormones to someone just because they're trans. You have to go a step beyond that to prove there's medical
agree.
need. So that's all
Right.
that I was saying. And as long as we're
Okay,
on the same
fair
page
agreement.
there, I think we're on the level.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
want
go ahead.
go ahead.
No,
I
you go
want
ahead.
to I want to kind of turn this because there's something I just need to understand. So at the age of I think 15 or 16, with parental consent, um, a teen is allowed to have a relationship with an adult, but they cannot determine or begin hormone therapy until 18. So, so to understand this correctly, we are saying as a society that a parent cannot allow a 16-year-old to make a decision on their own gender preference, but they are definitely allowed to make a decision on having relations with an adult. According to this bill, am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think to like argue in favor of the bill a little bit, like I,
No, no,
Well, dialogue
wait,
always.
wait.
That's kind of like we're
I
kind of
want
getting
to.
out of there because what I
No,
what
I want to.
Okay.
There's more to this question. The reason why I'm putting this up there is because we all understand that once puberty hits, extreme change happens to a person's body, which means in a lot of cases, especially with men that are having it, dysphoria or whatever else or whatever you want to call it, by the time they begin their therapy to begin to transition into what they see themselves as, they would not be able to pass enough in a society where we've already shown that if you don't pass, you can be demonized. Almost, it'd be. I think Idaho definitely doesn't have legislation protecting you from being able to keep or gain a job or anything like that. You're allowed to be discriminated against if you don't pass because
Yeah, but sir,
they
you're
can
kind of
say
you're
it
kind
either
of
way.
putting us leagues ahead. What that segment that we just got out of was about is defining what puberty blockers are primarily for. We, unless I'm wrong, have come to the consensus that puberty blockers are predominantly for pertaining to this bill or identity issues that Brinto Box brought up, solving the blocking primarily for
Well,
blocking
I'm
your
can I
saying
ask
like
a
either.
question to the left side of the panel real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm going to describe a situation and ask if it's something that you would be comfortable or uncomfortable with. So let's say there's someone who is 16 years old and they have gender identity dysphoria. They go and see a psychiatrist for this. they have conversations, they get a letter confirming their diagnosis of gender identity dysphoria. They go to an endocrinologist. The endocrinologist signs off. They agree that this person has gender identity dysphoria, and they decide to put this person on a puberty blocker. This person doesn't demand that people like believe that they are, let's say that they are assigned female at birth. They're not demanding that society, call them he or him. They're just taking this for now to like prevent their puberty from continuing. And it's a medically verifiable intervention that has been proven to reduce depression and anxiety and whatnot. Do you believe that with these sorts of gatekeepers in place, which we can show have long-term beneficial effects, do you think that there's like a moral reason to ignore those medically beneficial effects and ban it anyways? Because I think that's sort of the heart of the issue, right? I think that you guys would agree that, like, yes, there's literature showing that in general, these people, as they get older, benefit psychologically from having, their puberty delayed. But I think you would argue that even if these people might benefit, maybe there's like a corrosive effect in society by allowing people to do this. Is that kind of where you're at?
No.
And while you're removing the parent.
No. I wouldn't, because I think once you start getting into like, I guess, more broader conversations about like how this affects society and like what it means to be transgender, all that stuff, I think those are entirely separate conversations that
So
I just
Fanatiq,
personally.
what is your problem with providing, puberty blockers then?
I think the primary thing is that I would say that when you look at the idea that I think the majority of children who experience dysphoria, if left alone, or if when taking the wait and see approach, they stop being transgender. They desist by the time that they're 18.
That's true for very young children, but it's not necessarily true for older children. I think the other thing to recognize is that endocrinologists don't prescribe these hormones, or shouldn't, according to medical guidelines, until there have been multiple hoops that the people need to jump through in order to prove that they are going to be in the group that doesn't desist when they get older. So obviously I have personal experience with this. I had to spend probably 6 to 8 months just like talking continually with psychiatrists and various doctors. I had to drive like 6 hours out to talk to like an endocrinologist specialist, and all of that work is done to make sure that I'm in the group of people who isn't going to decide they don't want to transition later in life. And I obviously, like, I'm a case study of that being true, where I have no intention to desist. And so I think that, like, when we look at very young children, most of them who express like gender nonconformity don't express that when they're older, and that's less true when you get past puberty. But
Right.
It's still true that like a lot of people will desist. It's lower numbers, but I don't think it's a majority anymore, but like it is still a significant percentage. And so, I think it'd be bad if we prescribed hormones to all of these children, because I agree that lots of people will desist, but that's not what the medical literature is allowing currently. And so we don't need to necessarily ban that, because it's not the case that all of these children are getting these hormones. They shouldn't be getting all of these hormones. And if there is, that's a case of medical malpractice. That should go through the courts, and they should be, held
Right.
accountable.
So the thing is, like in your example, you were talking about giving puberty blockers to a person who is 16 years old, and at that point, that person has already fully gone through puberty. What is
No.
the effect of puberty blockers on the 16-year-old?
Yeah, I mean, puberty continues for a while. I think it's like Tanner stage 5. It can finish like 19, 20, depending on the person. So yeah, you shouldn't have gone through all of puberty by 16 years old, although you would have gone through the majority of it.
Okay, so I guess then in that case, yeah, I just, I think I'd probably
Can
be a
I-
little bit. Go ahead.
I
Well,
apologize.
let me just finish real quick.
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
I think when it comes to like a 16-year-old or something like that, when you have people who are a lot older, I mean, at this point, like in a lot of states, they already have like the ability to, like, we as a society say, oh, these people are at the age of consent and can like literally consent to sexual relationships and things like that. I think maybe I might, I don't know, I guess I'd probably need to think about it a little bit more, but it seems like I'd be a little bit more amenable to something like that.
As
But
long as there are hoops to jump through, right? Because I think
yeah,
that like
like,
if we're just allowing anyone to transition, that's I think something that we'd all agree is
but no,
bad.
I don't want that to be characterized as the argument
Well,
that I'm
wait, the
fighting
law
against,
never
because that's
says
not
the law doesn't
that's
say
not what I
that.
was talking about. I'm talking about like the idea of giving to children at the onset of giving these things to children at the onset of puberty, when we know that the vast majority of children will desist at that point. So then, if that's the case, then I think the idea that we would start giving them to them at that age, I think it's too premature when we know the vast majority will not continue in that. And then, of course, then now you have this regret and all of these other problems that can be associated with helping someone to transition that
I
shouldn't
agree
have.
with you, Fanatic. If I can ask just a quick follow-up question, do you think it's possible through having conversations with someone who's young, let's say 12, 13, to figure out if they're in the group of people that is going to desist or if they're in the group of people that's not going to desist? Do you think you can figure that out by interviewing this kid? Or do you think that's not something that you can determine?
I don't think that there's an interview that can guarantee how a child's going to feel when they're an adult, when they're 13 years old. No.
Okay.
I don't think we'd be able to know for sure. Do you think we'd really be able to just say, well, through this series of questions and these amount of interviews, we're able to know with 100% certainty that this 13-year-old is going to feel the exact same way when they're 18?
I don't think so. So I think that like with any medical intervention, there's a real and unfortunate chance that it doesn't succeed. So I think we have to all sort of recognize that it's not 100%. However, when we look at like when these medical guidelines are followed appropriately, the chance that someone desists is actually quite low. And so if you look at like total people who desist from gender nonconforming behavior as a child to adulthood, I agree that that number is quite high. It's over 50%, most ways that you measure it. But that's not how we figure out whether or not a child gets hormones. And when you look at like children who have actually gone through the vetting process in order to get hormones, it's something like less than 2% that actually desist. So yeah, so
Right.
it does seem to be pretty effective. But yeah, let's be realistic. There are problems.
Yeah, I was actually
I took it down in my notes here. I think that's a good part to kind of pause on. Based on, is it after the perception of the child or the perception of the adults and the medical professionals?
Yeah.
What would the right side of the panel say is the basis for which they make this choice?
The child's opinion doesn't matter that much. Unfortunately, I mean, like, probably fortunately, because like children are fucking stupid. And when you're a child, you think stupid things all the time. And so you can't let, and this is true of adults too, frankly, you can't just let someone like walk into a clinic and be like, I'm in terrible pain, I need opioids, right? You can't just like let someone determine what sort of medicine they get for anything. That is true with HRT as well.
So low in theory and then Doobie, because I know Doobie, I've seen your hand go up. I'm sorry we cut you out, but you got to step in there sometimes, sir. Get a little bit assertive. But I do appreciate the decorum. So low in theory, get in there.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on it, and it looks like actually Taft already touched on that already, in the fact that I do understand it, like the idea of like kids dissenting is fairly high, but that only happens when they haven't gone through all the necessary hoops in order to start HRT. HRT. From my understanding, that ideal is really low. But I just wanted to touch on something just really quickly. I find it kind of odd that it's like, why are we choosing to, if a parent and a child, have, and a doctor have all decided that this is the way that this person can go to end up having the best life they could possibly can have, and it's shown that if you go through all these hoops, the idea of dissenting is really, really low. Why are we choosing to stop that from happening? I have a hard time reconciling you're saying that you care about the child, but then at the same time you're doing something that could result in the child not having a good life in general. Like, especially when we look at the actual stats themselves. I just would love to hear the other side of the panel. Like, how do you reconcile these two things? How do you say we care about the child, but then at the same time you are doing things that will make the child's life harder? Anyone else can hop in at that point.
Yeah,
Sure.
Doobie, go for
Go
it.
ahead. Oh yeah, Doobie.
So I think the concern is, so first off, I think that I guess I should clear this up first. So I raised my hand up a while ago, and you're right, I should be more assertive. So I'll do that going forward. So dialogue always, you brought up the age of consent. So that, hey, 16 years old children are allowed to have sex with an adult. You know, how could we keep them from puberty blockers or whatever else? But actually, just I don't want anybody in chat to get ideas. If you're a 16-year-old, right, you actually in states where the age of consent is 16, you can't go and have sex with a 30-year-old, right? It's typically it's under 3 years age difference, right? So if you have sex with somebody outside of that 3-year age difference, it's going to be called rape. Right? So don't do that.
Well, what about in Idaho?
In Idaho, the age of consent is 18. Right? So
Okay.
and even there,
And that-
and if a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old would have sex, that'd be fine because they're within 3 years. Right? So it's not as cut and dry as 16 years old. You just have the age of consent.
Wouldn't you say that
out? Question where he was asking if the medical professional, the parents, and the child, right? Where do you vest the predominant weight of making the decision to go on puberty blockers?
So I think so another concern here, right? So I want to say the medical professional, but another concern is that my understanding is in the United States, at least, right? The model of care that they go with when someone expresses that they have like a gender identity disorder, that they feel they might have one, right? And they're questioning these things, is gender affirming, which might further solidify the idea that a person is transgender or does have gender dysphoria because their model of care reaffirms that belief, right, and supports that belief, right? So I have trouble saying it's on the medical professional if the model of care medical professionals are using reaffirms the belief of the patient who is a child here, right? A child who's confused and questioning and all these things, right? So, and another concern is that in a lot of states, Idaho included, there are massive pushes, right, by activists, by allies, quote unquote, to say that if a child is even considering that they might be trans, even questioning their gender, they should have access to puberty blockers, because if when they hit 16, they feel that they are trans and they have gender dysphoria now, hey, they then at that point they can make that decision. But leading up to that, if they have questions when they're 9 years old, they should have access to puberty blockers, because we don't want them to go through the struggle of not passing in the way that they'd like to if they make the decision that they're trans or find that they're trans, right? So that's another real concern, right? So it's not as simple as saying that we just leave it up to the medical professionals. If the medical professionals are reaffirming the gender issues, and if activists are currently pushing to massively broaden the range of people who get access to these things, right? So I'm giving that.
Someone's typed in a lot.
Yeah,
Someone's
super
Oh,
loud.
sorry. That was me. Sorry.
That's okay. So given that we do understand, and I know that there's like some controversy around these studies, but I've looked into all the counters to them, and they seem to mostly land on the idea that when they found that a transgender youth or a young person who identified as trans desisted, I think that number's like over 80%. Right. But they said that, hey, the reason that number's so high is because not all of those kids were like diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The issue there is that in a lot of spaces, even in the medical community, you'd be called a bigot for saying that a trans person needs to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria to be a valid trans person. Right. So this is an extremely complex issue that none of these debates are settled yet. Right. So I think I'm okay with Idaho putting their foot on the ground and saying, hey, this is our line right now. And that's where it is.
Yeah,
All right.
I want
It's
to
gonna go
agree with
Taftosh.
Doobie really quick. Oh, sorry.
That's gonna go Taftosh, Brento Box, and then Fanatic.
Yeah, so I agree with Doobie that this sort of like gender affirming care model is pretty dangerous, especially when we're talking about minors. Um, and I think that if the question is like, should we be quite conservative in who we give puberty blockers to? Should we have a lot of hoops for children to jump through before they're considered for this? I think the answer is absolutely, right? But this bill isn't saying you need lots of hoops or you shouldn't engage in this gender affirming model of care where you just take people at their word and give them hormones. If that's what it said, I think that I would be on board with this bill. I think that's an appropriate response. The problem is that it outlaws all care, right? And it doesn't matter how many hoops you jump through or if you can be proven to have, gender identity dysphoria that, goes back over an extended period of time and is severe, that is actually severely impacting your mental health, that is putting you at risk for suicide and so on. And I think that like if you can prove those sorts of you can prove a medical need for this sort of intervention, I think you ought to be able to receive the intervention because studies show that it's an effective intervention. And I don't want to give cover for these like crazy trans activists who are pushing the idea that like anyone should be able to get hormones regardless of where they are, just because they say they're trans. Because I think we agree that that's definitely not good. And I would really try to hone in on this specific bill and say that as the bill's written, outline like regardless of the situation, I think that's dangerous. And it's dangerous because we can show that these interventions have positive effects in general, and especially have positive effects when the person, is having severe body issues. So the fact that it outlaws like totally blind to that situation, I think is the problem.
Gotcha. Brento Box, you want to get in there?
I guess I would just be reiterating my point, but I do agree with Doobie's summation of it that ultimately I think it feels like the larger argument rests on sort of this. It's what it always comes down to whenever I have these conversations, but it comes down to this idea that unless the child is prevented from going through puberty, they will grow up in the wrong body or experience what people have decided to call, which I don't believe in, the wrong puberty. And then they will potentially commit suicide in the future, and society will have the blood of the suicide on their hands because they didn't let them transition when they were children. I feel like that is the ultimate like justification or thrust behind these types of things. But I don't think that's so cut and dry, and I don't think that's fair. And that kind of feels sort of like a hostage situation. And I don't think that is ultimately the natural, or not natural, but the more the likely outcome. I don't think that's the real calculus of what's being like discussed here.
What do you think is the
All
real
right.
calculus?
Well, really quick, I'm sorry.
ahead.
Okay.
Brento Box, we're gonna send a SWAT team to get that hostage situation off your hands. But Fanatic, you
Sure.
can go next because you were talking, but it was your turn.
So yeah, first off, I would say that like I could imagine that yes, that there's significantly less people who are desisting. Specifically, one, because you're already controlling for certain people before you end up giving them the puberty blockers, and then two, I would say that when you're going through this like kind of nebulous or I don't know, subjective or whatever word you want to use, like this like uncertain time as a young child talking about gender dysphoria, I would imagine that like talking to people like authority figures like doctors and your parents and psychologists and all of these people that you now look up to, and like being told that you're like this is this, like you are this, or this is what's happening, and so on and so forth, then I can easily understand why someone would readily accept that as truth and then it would be a lot harder to remove that ideology from them, number one. And then number two, I would think that the idea, dang, I forgot my second point. Break. But yeah, I mean, I think that point, I think once you start like affirming this through the powers that be and through authority figures, doesn't it make sense that people would be significantly less likely to desist? Even, yeah, just period. Like, heck, if there was no testing for their children, and all it was just having authority people like psychologists and doctors literally telling them this is what you are, or this is what you're experiencing. I think that would be enough to dissuade a lot of people from desisting. Oh, that was the second factor. The second factor was the pressure, the added pressure. I remember hearing stories about people who were trans, and then at that point they wanted to like detransition or desist. Both cases, those are two different things, and in both of those cases there's like insane amounts of backlash against them, because then they think, well, this is going to arm the other side, this will cause other people to start having more hateful ideology about the trans experience, and so on and so forth. And so as a result of that, you have a great deal of people who are afraid to transition. And
Yeah, I mean, I think that's unfortunately accurate. There's a ton of social pressure. And it goes back to like why I'm so frustrated with the topic being so politicized in the first place. Like, if people just looked at this like as it is, in a very realistic, like medical sense, like here's this medical issue, we're gonna try the solution. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, etc. I think we'd probably have better health outcomes. But the problem is like because it's become so politicized, I think a lot of progressives really they want people to be trans because it encourages this sort of like challenging of gender norms. And that's not what being trans, you know, should be, at least in my opinion, at its core. I think it's just like in the case, that we're talking about, I think it's just should be like this very plain sort of medical problem, psychological issue that we know that there's a treatment for. And, moreover, I think that we can acknowledge that a lot of young people are uncomfortable with their bodies. That's like a normal state of being a young teenager. And that's something that's been accelerated through social media, making people more uncomfortable, more aware of their bodies. And so when you have this big social movement that's giving people this sort of like out, it's telling them that like you might be trans and that like you should consider pursuing this. I think that's dangerous. And I think it's legitimate to say that like there's encouragement and pressure for people who might not otherwise be might not otherwise have gender identity disorder to transition and to take hormones. And I think we can have like a real conversation about that, and about maybe putting barriers in place, added barriers that really make sure that anyone who is going through these medical interventions has a medical need for it. I think having some barriers in place is probably good. My problem is just like the blanket banning. I think that's, that's going definitely too far.
Oh yeah, and I'm just in my head. I'm with you all the way, Taft, on this. Like, if it was just like specifically like you had to jump through like more hoops, I think even that would be even better. Like that would result in a lot. I think that would result in a lot less people dissenting. I think that like all the way. But the bigger issue is why is this particular issue like one is so politicized? I can't think of any other medical decision that is like legislated in this way. I think maybe you could maybe argue the vaccines in a way, but even then it's yeah. I can't think of anything else. So if we're going to like start legislating these things, I think there needs to be a conversation about like talking about all other types of like cosmetic surgeries or like medical interventions. It just seems like with the blanket ban, there's not really a care for the numbers as it's just a care for the politics, if that makes sense.
Doobie, go.
So I think the reason that's the case is because this specific mental health issue impacts not just these people, right? But there are requests or demands from some people as to how society interacts with those people, right? And about how they move about in society, right? So
Right.
So I think that's why, right? So if I don't want to, I hate to use this comparison, but it's the most like obvious one I can find, right? So if a schizophrenic person was talking to walls and you telling them that wall wasn't talking to them made them feel uncomfortable, but we couldn't find a way to treat that. So so therapists and medical professionals and our society started saying, hey, we need to affirm their belief that the wall is talking to them, because otherwise they're going to be depressed, they're going to be anxious, they might commit suicide, right? And we started shaming people for not reaffirming that delusion. I think you'd have exactly this kind of uprising, right? Like uproar about it, right? So I'm not saying that trans people are schizophrenic, right? But it's the idea that this mental illness doesn't just impact them, it impacts the way they move about in society. And when there are demands or requests from them, from activists, as to how they're treated by society and how they're allowed to move about in society. So it's not as simple as, this is just between them and their doctor.
Can you point to a single point where is that even true, that like not confirming that a schizophrenic is talking to wall would cause them commit suicide?
It was a hypothetical.
Yeah, no, I understand that,
hold
but
on.
like
So
the whole point of
I can explain really quickly.
Sure.
So actually, with schizophrenics, you're not supposed to affirm the delusions. You're specifically supposed to tell them that it's not true, right? So here, there's another mental health issue, an identity issue that this person is having internally, and rather than saying, "Hey, that's not true," society is telling you, "Hey, you need to say that is true," right? This thing they're feeling about themselves that isn't the case right now is true. At least biologically, it's not the case, but it is true to them. So we need to affirm that it's true, or they're going to feel bad, and we don't want them to feel bad. And of course, I don't want anybody to feel bad.
Okay.
Right,
So again, and I'm just going to touch on this because I understand that it's a hypothetical or an analogy, but I think it needs to be analogous to the situation. The wall is clearly not talking to the schizophrenic person, but a trans person believes that they are trans. So
okay, but a trans person,
there's a reality there.
A trans man doesn't have a penis naturally, right? So, like literally. So, it seems analogous.
So we're talking specifically about hormones. I'm not talking about specifically bottom surgery. If we're just talking about just and puberty blockers and hormones, if the reality is that this using these hormone blockers will stop me from having a male puberty or a female puberty, then and that is a actual reality, then that is something that we should, especially if they're jumping through all the correct hoops, something that we should affirm. I don't see any benefit to confirming that a schizophrenic is talking to walls, and I don't believe that you could even point to a single case where that would result in any real benefit to the schizophrenic. Well,
because they have other ways to treat schizophrenia, right? I think they have like medication, but so far as I understand, with most people who have like gender dysphoria, this is the most effective way to help them live a happy, healthy life, right?
Okay.
Is you affirm the gender and all this sorts of thing.
So are you agreeing with me then?
No, but I'm telling you, the reason these two things are analogous, right, is there is an internal belief that somebody has about themselves or the world, right? And in the way that society is saying that we should treat trans people is that we should affirm that internal belief. Whereas with the schizophrenic person, we're told not to affirm that internal belief. So what I was saying is that if we were told that with schizophrenic people that we should affirm that internal belief, you'd have exactly this kind of uproar about it.
But then that goes back to this question I just had. What benefit does society have by confirming that the schizophrenic is speaking to walls?
If there was no other way to treat schizophrenia, telling somebody that everything they believe about the world is false repeatedly would probably lead them to some kind of suicide, right?
But
or
low end
like
theory is saying
ideation.
that like if you affirm a schizophrenic, it doesn't benefit them, right? So like they don't see like their mental health improve because their understanding of the world could be like so fundamentally at odds. Like affirming them might actually be dangerous as far as like getting them into a dangerous physical or emotional situation. Whereas
that's the argument for this, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and so I think that like in the literature we do see that like giving hormones to people who have proven like GIT does have benefits, right? So I think that that's what low end theory is saying is like disanalogous. I want to like say, because I think you're hitting at like really the important part of this. I think that people should be allowed, and we're going to start with like presentation first, then move to the hormones bit. I think people should be allowed, as like part of their First Amendment right, to choose their clothing and their presentation how they want, right? I think we agree that that's okay, right? And that doesn't require society to buy into the fact that their clothing choices make them a man or a woman, or that their name choice makes them a man or a woman. And I think the same thing is true with hormones. I think that you can prescribe someone hormones on the medical basis that prescribing them hormones has beneficial mental effects. And you don't necessarily have to believe that that person is a man or a woman. So I think you can look at me or like other trans people, and you can say that like, yes, hormones have this beneficial mental effect on this person. And no, I don't believe that makes them actually, the gender identity that they want to present as. I don't think that those things are necessarily inherently contradictory. And I think the problem, politically speaking, is that a lot of trans rights activists really demand that society recognize them as the gender they identify with, and not so much that they're prescribed hormones which benefit them mentally. So we'll get into this when we talk about like the sports bans. I think it's like, I don't think that there's anything that like guarantees you the right to compete with people who have different genitals than you, or necessarily like the same genitals. So I think that that would, for example, be like a step too far. But I think that as long as we're centering this, and the bill, again, the bill isn't saying that like no one can be forced to affirm a gender identity. I think that might be a legitimate bill, but the bill is saying you can't prescribe puberty blocking or puberty delaying medicines to anyone for, for any gender issues. And I think that's the issue here. And it's not necessarily like an affirming thing, because I think we agree that like forcing society to affirm or buy into your gender identity, as you see with something like C16, that bill in Canada, I think is probably not a good thing. But I think banning the healthcare is a bad thing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly my point.
I don't know. I guess for me, I'm always going to sit here and say that I think we've kind of stretched the argument, because so okay, then let me ask it this way then. Do you think if they were to change that limit to age 16, if they were to say no medical puberty blockers or any of those things to people before the age of 16, would you be fine with that one, Tough Touch?
I think it would be better. I think that you can probably find, for example, like I started puberty blockers before the age of 16. So you can like find examples of people who benefit from this. And I think it would be bad if you like banned that outright. I think over and over, I would just say that there needs to be like medical procedures in place to verify that someone benefits from a treatment. And as long as those procedures are met, I think it's legitimate to provide them with a treatment. I think it's a little bit like saying like, well, lots of people who are like below age 16 don't need like heart bypass surgery, right? And so that like we shouldn't, provide that to them because, this is a fucking awful hypothetical. Ignore that.
Yeah, it's really bad.
I was gonna say actually something that you could probably use is like, there's probably like a bunch of like maybe like overweight children that don't need liposuction, right? That's
sure. That'd be a perfect example. Yeah, it's like
really quick tap tosh golf clap for the
recognizing how bad of an example it was, like midway through. Be like,
I was taking notes.
This is not working.
I gotta get on this. I gotta.
Good pull up on that one. Just pull right out. Yeah.
Good job.
But yeah, like I think liposuction is a great analogous example. If you want to use that one instead, Taft.
Use that.
Yeah.
That one I can't make.
I mean, I would just say that like there are examples that we can find of people who are under the age of 16 who would benefit from puberty delaying hormones. And the fact that we're like not allowing that when we might be able to understand and verify that they would benefit it's plainly just like a political move, because people don't like the sort of trans rights activist movement, which is maybe legitimate, but I don't think you're actually like fighting against that sort of movement. I think you're just blocking like very specific medical interventions, which are usually justified, usually don't result in desistance. So I think that the target here is totally wrong. And again, as we agreed earlier, I think we're all in favor of like, maybe these things need to be a little bit more conservative and a little bit harder to access. But I think there are examples where people would benefit under the age of 18 or under the age of 16 from puberty suppression. And I think blocking it out
How do we
is just
determine
not
that?
really good. Through interviews.
We use the medical professions. We use
Yeah.
we use the medical professionals to understand those things. That's we shouldn't really be focusing on what society says. That includes your conservatives on one side and your trans activists on the other side. We shouldn't be using their opinions at all. The only ones that should really matter is going to be the person who's involved. If the parent is involved, the parent as well, and the medical professionals. Society doesn't matter at that point.
Emma Rosa.
Sure, I guess I've never made an
Don't say
argument
this.
like from the
This
perspective
is so
of
annoying.
society.
I'm not
Mine's
trying
always
to be
been,
a good
like, basically from the
transis.
perspective
I'm
of,
just
like,
presenting
what
my
would be
actual
medical
opinion,
necessity and,
which I think is
whether or not there
legitimate
could be
and
harm associated with like the
well
idea of
argued.
people wanting to desist, and now their parents have spent
Like, I
quite a
don't
bit of
fucking
money
care what people
on
think
getting them
about
these
me.
hormones, and now they feel particularly committed to the idea that I can't not be trans now
Like, I'll
because
never
at
align
this point
myself
I've gone
with
through all of this. My parents have
like
gone through
JQ
pain,
Rowling.
like coming
I'll
to the
never
terms
suck
with the
up to
fact
like
that I'm
JQ
trans.
Rowling on
My
Twitter
family and
because
friends, I've forced them
like
all into
fuck,
doing this thing and to kind of
I'm
like
not, I have a
validating my
spine.
experience. I've like put a literal penalty
Yeah.
and fee on my parents for that. And so all of these things combined, and now all of a sudden I got to tell them, you know what, I guess I was kind of wrong about that, despite the fact that I've been told a billion times by everyone else, all of society, everything else saying, no, you're not, no, this not, no, da 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 da, and my own brain that I'm like trying my best to fight, because it's not like it's just an easy thing to just immediately say, hey, I'm trans. There's an inner battle that happens, I would think, with every trans person. So then with all of those things and with all of those things, the idea that now you've actually gone through the medical thing, you've done years of therapy, you've done all of this process, and you're now just going to slowly change your mind and go, nope, you know what, guess what, I'm not trans. That's not real. I mean, we've heard how many horror stories of people who have literally sat there and been homeless in college because they didn't want to admit to their parents that they dropped out. Right. So like, if we can have those kinds of stories, the idea that there would be trans people or people who who thought they were trans not going through this is crazy. So then that's why it feels like it's a little bit scary to me when we're thinking we're going to be trusting these kind of ideas to children. And then the only justification for trusting this idea to children is to say, well, once children have gone through these really hardly affirming authority figures that are going to tell them that they're right, then they probably won't desist. Like, doesn't mean that there's not any regret. That doesn't mean there's not any harm. All of those things.
Do you have like any examples of like doctors and medical professionals like forcing a child to like go with the gender affirming surgery?
I would provide you an example for that if that was at all embedded in any of the argument that I just gave you. But fortunately, I'm not stupid enough to say something like that. So no, I don't have any examples of that, nor does that have anything to do with the argument.
But I could have sworn that you had just said that like all these affirming professionals, like is that what you meant by?
Well, an affirming professional, in other words, a doctor saying, yes, I think you should be receiving these puberty blockers. And
okay,
yes, I think you should, and yes, I think you should receive this hormone stuff. If that's the case, then I'm pretty sure that I would qualify that as something that's affirming. And that would probably be, I mean, I don't have to go any further. That would be affirming to a child.
The way you're wording it just sounded like you were saying that the doctors were like kind of affirming the gender identity, but like it kind of felt like in like an authoritative way, like they're saying like, hey,
that is what he's saying.
No. I'm saying they are an authority. Like a doctor is an authority,
and so therefore it is an authoritative way.
Right.
No. Again, so what I'm thinking is when I hear that word, I'm thinking that the doctor's like forcing that child to continue. That's what I thought that you were saying. So again, I apologize. But that's just what I thought that you were saying. But if you're saying that, like, so are you saying like the doctor's opinion is not valid at all? Like, what do you mean by that?
I'm not saying that the doctor.
He's just saying that, like, if a doctor
I'm asking to clarify. I'm not putting an opinion on you. I'm just simply asking what's the word for a clarifying question. So this is not me.
No, I'm not saying that the doctor's opinion isn't valid at all. Like, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, well, I feel like I really said it out. But no, I'm not saying that a doctor's opinion isn't valid, because what a doctor is doing, a medical doctor is job is to determine whether or not a person is medically able to receive that, like whether or not there'd be any harm. That's their job there. It's a medical doctor, and I would never question the medical doctor's authority medically.
So, okay, let me just throw out a hypothetical. Let's pretend that we're remaking this bill, right? And in this bill, we say that, like, I don't know, like, you have to, like, go through, like, I don't know, like, you have to have, like, 3 doctors confirm, 3 separate doctors over X amount of time to confirm
Confirm what?
confirm that this child is actually trans and would benefit from gender affirming. Let's just start off with hormones.
I don't think a doctor can affirm that a person is trans. That's not their job.
That's literally their job.
So my understanding,
yes.
my understanding of the gender.
Wait, hold up, April. You're saying that is their job?
Yeah, that's the job of every doctor, to determine if a patient would actually benefit from a specific medical intervention. That's their job in every scenario, regardless of the thing.
A medical doctor is supposed to be determining that a child is actually trans?
No, a medical doctor is determining
so
whether. Okay,
That's the
yes, I'll say yes then, for the sake of the argument, because yes, the doctor is trying to figure out whether they would benefit from the intervention, regardless of what the intervention is.
Those are not the same statements. The statement about whether or not a doctor is able to determine medically whether something like a person can benefit from that is not the same thing as like maybe I don't know, a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist being able to determine whether or not a person is trans. Those are 2 totally different things.
No,
and
they're
that's why
not totally different.
Are psychologists not doctors?
Are they not medical doctors? No, they're not medical doctors.
But
Not
no,
in the same
that's what
sense.
medical. I don't know what you mean. You're talking about like pediatricians, I guess, like specifically, or someone who's like. I think if someone's like has no experience with what gender identity dysphoria is, then no, it's not their responsibility. But like as long as a doctor has training in this, right? Whether they're an endocrinologist or a psychologist or a family practice doctor who works with trans patients, then yeah, it's their responsibility to figure out whether someone actually has gender identity dysphoria and therefore would benefit from this treatment. So yeah, that is their responsibility.
So you're telling me right now that a sole individual, a medical doctor by himself would be the sole can be the sole determining factor for whether or not a person gets puberty blockers, or would it require that medical doctor and a psychologist and something else?
I believe that for under 18 people, it requires a psychologist, like a written letter as well.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yes, that. They're not that. And the reason why you require that is because you need that to determine whether or not the person is actually trans. Because the medical doctor is not his job to determine that. That's why you would need that letter.
Low end theory also said 3 doctors, which I think is implying that there's a psychologist involved and an endocrinologist.
No, I've been making that specificity this entire time, and you guys have been
in my hypothetical.
Why would you make that specific? Wait. Why would you make that specific thing? Like when she's saying doctor, she's directly talking about psychologists.
No dialogue. This entire time when Low End Theory and I were going back and I kept specifying a specific medical doctor, I made a very clear distinction from a psychologist and a
Why would you make that distinction when I'm pretty sure neither of the other 2 are making that distinction?
Because they've been arguing with me this entire time and pretending.
Fanatic, when you say medical doctors, psychologists are medical doctors, and so are endocrinologists. So like it's confusing when you say this. I guess you're talking about like you're talking about like a family care doctor who doesn't have experience when you say medical doctor, right? Which is just like, I think that's where the confusion is.
Okay, well, as long as it's clear now, that's fine.
So I think I think a good thing to clarify here is this. Stop me if I'm wrong. It would be fair to characterize that the right side of the panel, Low End Theory, Dialogue Always, and Taftage, put 100% of the weight into the mind of the medical care physician.
No.
Correct?
No, like, wait, because I have to go all the way back to my original statement to add in what I was talking about was a combination of the doctors that we're talking about across the board, not just a medical doctor, the parent, and then like again, associating factors, people that interact with the child, people that understand the child. It would have to be across the board. I don't understand why we made this specifically going all the way down to a medical doctor. I don't understand why we wait.
I'll explain why. Taftage is a psychologist a medical doctor?
Yeah.
Okay. Google that for me, please.
Okay.
Continue with your question, Dialogue Always.
Can I clarify my point just before we go on, if you wouldn't mind, because I feel like one, like, again, when I was saying doctor, I was specifically talking to people that had a medical degree,
Doctorate.
yeah, a doctorate in psychology, and endocrinology, which would give them the ability to talk about these specific issues, because we're talking about the mental state of the trans person, and we're also talking about whether or not they would benefit from hormone blockers, which is a part of endocrinology. So when I was specifically speaking to, okay, you have to go through all these additional doctors, which was my original hypothetical, would we then be okay, assuming that like we're going through significantly more hoops now, right? Ultimately making this a lot harder, but we're going through significantly more hoops. Would we then be okay with it, knowing that the chances of dissenting are extremely low? So, anyone
And
free to
I think
respond?
that's why again and I have to go back a bit. I think that's why the hostage argument was so caught me off guard. And I don't want to try to push any motives on when it was used, but
You can
it's
speak
not
to it.
really a
You're the
hostage.
one who said it. So if
Yeah,
you, I just want to know what you
not
think.
really it's
Fanatic,
not really a hostage.
I Googled it and it says, yes, by law in the United States, psychologists are doctors. While psychologists are doctors, they cannot prescribe or administer medical treatments. So I think maybe that's what you're getting at about
No, I'm
like
looking right now. When
prescription.
I Googled it, it came up and it said psychologists are often doctors, but not medical doctors. Instead, they may be a PhD, doctor of philosophy, usually research focus, or PsyD, doctor of psychology, usually with a clinical focus. In the state of California, psychologists must have a master's and doctorate degree in psychology, whereas a psychiatrist would be a medical doctor,
So you're saying like
an
an
MD,
MD
or
specifically.
D. Oh, right, MD. What does MD stand for?
Medical doctor, not that. Does not stand for medical doctor.
Okay, well, maybe we were just getting our terms mixed
Yeah,
up.
I mean, I
'Cause-
think we're sort of in the
yeah,
weeds here, but like
yeah,
in regards
Because
to
again,
I wanna get
No,
into a
no, no,
different
no, no.
No, 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 no. We're
Okay,
not
I'll
in the
stop.
weeds.
I'll stop.
We're
I'll
not in the
stop.
weeds. I gotta say, I'm following. We're not in the weeds.
We're not
what
in
I
the
mean
weeds. It's really
by in
simple.
the weeds, we're like,
MD is doctor of medicine, and
but like
that's
we
and,
all
and that's
agree,
what
we all
what MD
understand
is, and
what we're
psychologists are
talking
not
about
MDs.
here.
Okay, but
wait,
Like
because
a
we can
psychologist
actually
is a
point out
medical
I don't think
specialist.
and I
Okay,
don't think
that's a
psychologist
either
deals
different
with mental
statement.
health.
Okay, but like
I don't think low end
you
theory
can see how
or
that's
Tashtash
confusing.
said medical doctor though.
I did a
I don't
thousand
believe
times,
so.
and they argued with me the
I,
entire time while I did so.
but again,
Yeah, we're
I literally just
that's
asked her
why
a
I
direct
asked. But
question:
that's why I
are they
asked you why
medical
did.
doctors? She said yes.
But that's why I asked you why did you insert that into the conversation if
Because I
the
was
other two
specifically
never said that?
But
because
you guys
at the
wanted
time when they were
specific.
talking about an endocrinologist, and an endocrinologist is a medical doctor, and a medical
On
doctor is
top
an
of multiple other
they
fields.
they didn't,
You're
and that's
talking
why
about
I specify. Listen, hold on, dialogue always. I'll make it this simple for you. If you weren't following such that you don't understand what I was saying, then that's fine. I'm telling you, I made this specificity that it wouldn't be down to a sole doctor who would be an endocrinologist or someone like that. It would need to also be a psychologist who is not a medical doctor. That's what I specified. So since I went to that specificity and they were pushing back on that, I literally just asked Taftaj, is a psychologist a medical doctor? To which they said yes. So clearly, both of them were pushing back against me. If you didn't catch that specificity, that's on you. That was a specificity I made, and that's the thing that they conceded to, and they were both wrong there.
Yeah, okay. I think we can
um,
move off. I think I'll agree with you, or I'll take your word that like psychologists don't have MDs, right? They have PhDs, they work in the health field, but they don't have an MD, right? That's what you're saying. And we can agree, right? Okay.
And so
Excellent.
that person alone, like a medical doctor alone, should not be the person to determine that a child is trans, right?
Okay, I would go a step further and I would say that like in order to prescribe hormones to a child, you need a doctor, right? You probably need a psychologist. You also need the child and the parents to all be on board. So if any one of these people vetoes it, I think it's appropriate to not allow that person hormones. If the child is saying like, no, I don't want this, obviously don't give it to them. If the parents like not agreeing, I think that's an appropriate place to say, no, we shouldn't give them hormones. And if either of the medical specialists, either the doctor or the psychologist, is also saying no, then I think it's appropriate to not allow them, right? So that's where I would be on this. I would say that you need all of these groups to be on board. And it's not enough for just the child to want it. And it's not enough for like just the child and their primary care physician to want it. Good.
And can I just ask just a really quick question? Both a psychiatrist and a psychologist, they both study mental health. Am I wrong on that assumption?
They're in the
Sure.
medical
Okay.
field. They don't have an
Yes.
MD, is what he's saying.
Well, a
Which,
No,
psychiatrist does. A
I
psychiatrist
understand
Okay,
that. So I think that when you're saying we're getting into the weeds, I think that was the comment is just the fact we're talking about two types of doctors that are studying mental health. Just that we're not using the correct word for the one that has the MD. I think that if I was going to use the argument that I keep trying to like the hypothetical I keep trying to use, we use a psychiatrist, we use an endocrinologist, we use all these particular doctors, and we have to do I don't know 3 of each, right? We have to have 3 psychiatrists, we have the three endocrinologists. We have to go through all these additional hoops. Would we then be okay with this type of medical intervention, even below the age of 16?
I don't think so, because I mean, I guess so. So where would the limit be? Well, rather than answer your question with the question, I would say that no. I would say that it seems pretty immoral to me to do this thing to people that's going to be a huge cost to the parents, probably cause a lot of mental distress to the children to like have to go through this thing where they would otherwise desist.
What are,
And
sorry.
I understand that it will be a lot harder for people to do it, but wouldn't
and
the
that, I'm
goal
saying
be
that
to
that's
try
the
to make it as
problem.
yeah, but wouldn't the goal be to try to make it as hard as possible? So therefore, we could have less of a possibility of people dissenting.
Well,
Wouldn't
desist,
that be
and
the goal?
I think the reason again, it depends on what their reasoning for not desisting is. Is their reason for not desisting specifically because they have all of this additional pressure now that they've like hardlined committed to this position, and now that their parents have incurred like financial costs and burdens and all of the things that they've gone through, and so now because of that they're not desisting, but otherwise they would have. Because if that's the case, and now that they have societal and social pressure to commit to this thing that they are no longer feeling inside, which I think could have long-term mental health ramifications, then I would say probably no, I wouldn't be okay with that. And to my knowledge, I think that's the case.
I
Okay.
find it
I can put your
impossible.
mind to rest because this is not the case. There are actually studies on the outcomes of transgender children as they become adults. And if it was true that a significant or meaningful portion of these children didn't desist purely out of social pressure, but were in fact unhappy with their transition thus far, we would see that reflected in the data. We don't see that reflected in the data because what we see is that there are positive effects on mental health, whether that's depression rates, anxiety rates, or the subjective rating of body satisfaction. All of those things are affirmed again and again to decrease or to get better over time as a result of these hormones. So there's probably some people, I'll acknowledge, that don't desist out of social pressure. But that group of people is not big enough to be reflected in the data as far as showing that a majority of people have negative effects. So there are studies of this. We understand that in general it has positive effects.
And I mean, I think I find the issue is that I know everybody rolled their eyes when I first brought it up a while back, but I think with the argument that you're making, Fanatic, about what could possibly happen and how somebody might still want to transition, but they feel like all these things are making them feel like they shouldn't, or they should stay the course, or they feel whatever. That's literally why I brought up other issues that are allowed to be consented with the parents at the age of 16, because there's a
Which
lot
ones
of
did you bring
problems.
up?
When I went
I,
when I went all the way back to like being able to, and I don't know why he brought up 30. I never even said the age 30, but when I was talking about the age of consent laws.
mhm.
So with the effects of that, you have STDs, you have children, you have societal ramifications of being sexually active, period. All of those things are things that weigh heavily on a person's brain. But at 16, with parental consent, they are allowed to make that decision about their personal lives. for the 16-year-old in that same position, now you are giving the argument that even if down the line they are saying that they are okay with the transition they made, you still feel like that because there's other societal pressures set upon them, that is enough to be okay with the bill banning someone from doing anything about their transition until the age of 18.
Well, no, I'm sorry if you missed this part of the conversation, but earlier
But that's
I
the
already
bill.
no, I'm sorry if you missed this part of the conversation earlier, but what I'd already conceded to April was specifically that it is something that I have to start considering when we start getting into things like the age of consent, that then I would start being a little bit. Do
But
you remember me making that
no,
concession, April?
Fanatic.
Wait, hold on. April, do you remember me making that concession?
Yeah, I
I'm
think
not,
you've been
Okay,
fairly
so,
good
so
at
I'm
like
not
right,
asking
but
you.
it's
Wait. I
not
didn't ask you about the
Dialogue
concession.
always. You have to let him finish. You
right.
gotta
So
let
then,
him
But
finish.
he's not. Okay.
I am. So what I'm saying is I don't. So the argument went beyond the bill. If you're still stuck at just is the bill good, then already Taftaj moved me past the bill. Originally, it was yes, the bill's good. Taftaj gave some points that made it seem more reasonable to start pushing back against what the bill says. And I already conceded at 16. And clearly, if I've conceded at 16 and the bill is still at 18, then clearly I don't think that the bill is perfectly fine there. So I've already moved that.
I think
Is
Fanatic's
your
doing pretty
argument
good.
not? No. Is your argument not that one of your concerns with being able to allow a child to be able to go within within their medical whatever to be able to do anything is the fact that you literally argued that even if they got to that point where they're not transitioning back, it's because they feel that they might be bothered by outside outside push or anything else for how they may feel since they've already transitioned. Did you not make
Yeah.
that argument?
Yes, I
Okay, so I'm
specifically.
addressing
Let me
that
finish. Let me
argument. I'm
respond.
not
Let me
addressing.
respond.
Let him
Now, let
respond.
me
You
respond.
asked the question.
I specifically made that question for young people like 10 and 11 years old because Taftaj added on specific nuance that detailed that people at 16 years old, once they get it, they're less likely to have these things. And so if you can show me mathematically that the numbers aren't the same, such that people at a certain age are less likely to go through this and they're not going to be desisters, then at this point, then now my argument doesn't stand up anymore. And if my argument is based on the idea of desisters and the problem that happens with that, then it applies at one age and not at another age. You know that the data is not fixed. Just every person at every age has the same desistance rate. So that's why I adjusted it.
All right.
We're very
And
heated.
there's no fair way to move on from this. We're going to leave that part there. We're going to go on to our last section, which is sports. Specifically in Texas, they pushed legislation forward that would only allow transgender people to compete in sports with people that aligned with their sex at birth. Some see this as anti-LGBTQ legislation. Is this the same as previously discussed legislation?
Do you guys mind if I start off on this one?
Yeah, go for it. Dive in.
So I think like all the bills that we've discussed this evening. By the way, I want to say I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. I think like all the
Because of the
bills.
modding. It's because of the
yeah.
modding.
Yeah, that actually makes a whole lot of a difference. It really does. Just like all these bills, I think that just at the end of the day, they're all just very like emotional bills that really don't do anything. So my understanding of the Texas bill, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on this one, is just simply a bill affirming fairness in sports for girls specific or females at female assigned at birth people in general, because it specifically says that girls are allowed to compete in men or boy sports, and I'm trying to use the correct terminology, but I'm sure everybody knows what I mean. Girls are allowed to compete in men's sports if there is no other alternative for them available. So I would just say that, I mean, there's a really easy way to just like completely disregard this bill, and it's just like no longer have gender or sex specific leagues within schools. I feel like that would ultimately make this particular point moot in general. Anybody else can touch on this afterwards?
Are we in opening statements, or are we just talking?
Yeah, we're opening up on this one.
Yeah, we're opening up on this particular topic.
So Brento Box.
Yeah, but if someone wants to respond, they go right ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that would I think the reason that we have the sports segmented this way is because we've learned essentially that there's the competition between biological male and biological female, specifically around like, you know, once you've hit puberty and you've started developing, then men have a biological advantage over women, and I think we've segregated the sports by sex because of that biological advantage. I don't think that.
Yeah, I think the
I don't think
argument
that is a
against that.
solution.
I think the argument against that is specifically when you look at when someone who is trans goes through HRT after a specific point. I think the advantage actually goes down quite a bit. Almost to the point where I don't even think it's really even statistically relevant anymore. And we see this specifically in the Olympics. If I remember correctly, trans people have been allowed in the Olympics since the 70s or the 80s. And I cannot think of a single point where someone who was trans like dominated any particular sport that they were in, whether it be male to female or female to male.
Okay, you can say that
through,
about the
like-
Olympics. Can you think about? Do you think that's the case currently and across the nation and in regard to all sports? And actually, I do believe there was a case of someone doing well in the Olympics.
So-
Go ahead.
Well, so you're I mean, if that is the case, even then, that case would be extremely like small in comparison to all the other times that has happened, even within the Olympics. I would have to see a large amount of data showing that trans people after HRT specifically, because I do understand the difference between obviously men who have gone through people assigned at birth had going through a male puberty and then competing in women's sports. I could see that there could be a strong argument for that. But if we're just talking about specifically HRT and that early phase before puberty, I don't think that there is an example of like, or at least very, very, very few examples of that showing a significant advantage. If someone's a little bit more like well read on the stats, feel free to correct me. But I feel like I've read on that quite a bit, and it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
know.
there
It
can
seems
be
like there's,
long-term
plenty of
effects.
examples where we can see like in specific things like powerlifting and things like that, where like trans women are absolutely destroying the competition and breaking like long held records and things like that.
Or look at
I
Leah
mean,
Thomas
Did
in
they go
swimming.
through a male puberty or no?
I believe so.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
like, look
well,
at
then
Leah
again,
Thomas
that would
swimming.
be
Like, look at
my
her
objection
shoulders.
point.
I'm sorry, I was reading some other things during the time you're talking. I might have missed that
Yeah.
point. So then, basically, are you just saying that okay, as long as they like transition like pre-puberty, then you would? I'm sorry. So would you wait? Let me say it clearly. So would you be for the banning of all trans people from competing in sexes that are not with the lines at birth, if they didn't transition pre-puberty?
Like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, because like we also have to take into account the fact that there are males out there that are weaker than females. This is known.
You don't make rules. You don't make rules based off of the idea that there can be some outliers. You make rules based off of the norm. So we obviously know that the average male.
I mean,
is
this
stronger than the
rule,
average
this
female.
law,
And that's
itself
even
is
more
based on
pronounced
outliers.
for
No, it's
sports,
not. This
right?
law is well. I mean, I guess if you stretch it to a whole different abstract way of saying it, but the average male is stronger than the average female, which is why we ended up like separating the sexes in that way. And in the same sense, then, and you sounded like you were trying to make the argument for specifically people who transitioned before puberty, that those people, it would make the most sense that they're able
I
to
think
compete
that
in
would
those
make the
things.
most
But
sense.
that's not a real. That's
Yeah.
not a real argument. That's not a real argument. If at the same time, when I'm asking you, so then for all people
I
who
just realized it
transition
was
after
muted.
puberty, then would you still have the same argument then that those people should be banned? And you're saying no, they still shouldn't. Then that means that this isn't a real argument.
Well,
That's
that wasn't my argument. I specifically only talked about HRT before puberty.
And I specifically asked you a question about that.
And then on the other half, I'm going to clarify. I'm going to speak to that specifically. On the other half, I think maybe there should just be a non-gendered specific league in like other types of sports. In that way. So then
in that case, so you're saying those deadlifters, what would happen to all of the women deadlifters and when we do that, and the women's records and the women's scholarships that are taken
I'm
by
not
trans.
I'm not advocating for low end theory's position here, but to steal man, he'd probably say that like if women place within the top like 50%, that's considered like good, and if they place below that, it'd be considered bad. So it'd like switch to a percentage base, and then you'd like still get
Sure.
so like if a
Wait.
woman's like top 200, that might be the same as like a man being like top 100. I think that's how you would make
Wait,
the
so
argument,
then-
but
Okay.
Wait,
Go
so then
ahead.
in this
Go ahead,
case,
Fanatic.
then it's no longer a merit-based argument, right? It's no longer about merit, about winning and all of those things, and we're still segregating them by like way of like the way that we're giving the scholarships, and still deciding a man's scholarship and a woman's scholarship, still deciding like. So how and who's determined the victor? If we have like a women's soccer team versus a men's soccer, I'm sorry, no, they're not integrated, right? And so then what happens in these team sports now, right? Like there's just so many problems that come with this.
There's
It
a
just
lot of
doesn't work.
problems.
I understand it makes it like overly complicated. This is
Not
reason why
complicated. It doesn't work.
Well, it does
Yeah.
work when it comes to pre-HRT. It does
Okay.
work.
No. Get past the pre-HRT thing,
Well-
because again, I don't think it's a valid argument if you're still arguing for even post-HRT. We're talking about the post-HRT thing.
Well, my post-HRT argument was just specifically like just have non gender denominational
Sure.
sports leagues.
Can I say something low in theory?
Sure.
This is more to that argument. I mean, I've heard many people make this kind of argument before. I always feel like that argument is maybe more of kind of comes from an attempt to disregard the inconsistencies that arise when people who have transitioned compete in sex segregated sports. I always feel like it's almost this appeal that I hear that people say like, well, like our system is going to make sense. Let's just get rid of the system. But I think that's always just kind of like, it's kind of wanting to ignore the issue.
Well, no, because again, I'm not getting rid of the system. I'm just adding another part to it.
You're eliminating the concept of gender-based competitions, right?
You'd
There
have to
can still be-
completely redo the system at the very least,
Yeah.
right?
But I think the system is actually correct. So I don't think redoing the system. I think you want to redo the system because your ideas are inconsistent.
I mean, moreover, I think it's like, even if we could prove that there's like no difference in competency or ability of like trans athletes when they like switch genders or switch like the gender league, specifically in regards to like trans women, I think even if we could prove that, I don't think it's necessarily true that trans people like have a right to be on like the gender female league if they identify as female. Because I think it's getting to like what society is required to affirm. And I think that like you shouldn't require society to like necessarily buy into the fact that like you are a woman now. If you want to take hormones and this has like medically beneficial effects, great, take hormones. But I don't think it's then the responsibility of everyone else to be like, okay, now we're going to treat you like a woman in every circumstance. I think that's their decision. And so the idea that
do trans people just not to get to play sports, or
no, they can play sports, but I don't necessarily think they should be like, you should force leagues to allow them on the team or the league that is their preferred gender, right? So like, I think if a league wants to have it so that like, yeah, we allow men and women to all, swim this competition and we all rank them together in one giant list, sure, like that's the league's decision. They can do that if they want to. And if a league, or a sports organization wants to separate it out and wants to have trans women competing with biological males, I think that that's also should be up to the organization.
So don't you think that points to
real quick?
Okay.
Well, I just on the topic, I think this isn't like an anti-trans bill. It seems like a pro-female bill. And to be clear, HRT is not provided to minors in Texas, right? So you get that at 18 plus in Texas. So
I was specifically speaking on just the data that would show that like these people are getting an advantage. So HRT, I wasn't speaking
well, to be clear, that there is data on this, and even after a year of HRT, there is still massive advantage for biological males.
It also
versus
depends on the
biological
sport,
women.
right? Because like if you look at like Leah Thomas in swimming, I think there's like a clear example of, even if she has like normal female hormone ranges, she has certain like biological structural advantages in how her body is built. For example, like
Just
very
the size
wide
of her lungs.
shoulders.
Like the
Yeah.
volume of her lungs.
yeah, and volume of her lungs, like size of the, chest cavity, that are going to provide her advantages. So,
Yeah.
that's regardless of HRT.
Yeah, and to be clear, again, they've done their recent studies on this. I was looking it up to pull it up for you guys, but I can post it in chat in a bit. So even after a year of this of HRT, I think there's a reduction of like 10%. It was the highest reduction they found, but it's not. They're not coming down to like female levels of like in terms of like their strength and all this sort of thing.
So
Um,
And
wait,
to be
really
fair, I
quickly,
think the
but I
Olympics
think
requires 2 years or longer.
yeah. So really quickly, but really quickly though, I think the statement earlier that this could easily be solved by just removing sex-based restrictions in sports kind of demonstrates to me like one of the major issues here. Right, this is kind of like it demonstrates like a kind of male privilege, right, on this topic. Because if we didn't have those restrictions, the reality is that women would be at a massive natural disadvantage in most professional sports. Right.
No,
So, and I think
didn't
saying things,
speak.
I think saying
Right,
something
go
like
ahead.
that just totally discounts like the wants and
Yeah,
needs
that's
of women who biological women, if you want to call them that, who want to get into these things, who are going for scholarships, who have worked just as hard as men, and now because and this is an issue that a lot of feminists have with trans people, right? They feel like men are pushing into women's spaces and replacing them and pushing and demanding that they replace them by having access to all these spaces. And in sports, if you have a trans person, and if you have people who say just announcing that you're trans and deciding that you're trans is enough for you to be validly a trans person, right? Then you absolutely would have someone like that replace most of even a mediocre guy, right? In some of these sports would outcompete the women just based on his biological advantages. Right. So
right.
I think we need to be sensitive to the needs of women here.
You're arguing against something that I didn't say. I didn't say eliminate sex-based leagues. I just said maybe start leagues in which gender is not specifically specified. These are not going to be replacing all women's and men's leagues. It's just specifically there is a league specifically for those people that
Sure.
would choose.
I think that's
choose to
usually
meet
the
on a
men's
trans
league,
level.
though, because like
That's true, but yeah, that's not the issue because that's not what's being put forward and that's not what's being discussed. Like,
But really quickly though, just
No.
hit
Let
on something
Brendan
that
talk,
April.
because I think he can put it back on track because I'm seeing where he's going. So Brinzelbach's finish.
yeah, the issue is not that there's not an option for men and women to play together in some way. It's that people who identify as women want to compete solely against other women. And you're saying, well, if we just had an option, then that wouldn't, for where everyone competing against everyone, that wouldn't be the case. But we could always do that. We choose to do it this way because we recognize the differences in the sexes via their performance in sports. We've chosen for things to be this way because we feel like this is the most optimal way to reflect even and fair competition. And just the suggestion that we not do things this way be the correct solution, I feel like ignores the issue.
And can I just say really quickly? So I'll give an example of the NFL. There actually is no restriction on the NFL for women. Right, females can be in the NFL. But the reality is that they are not competitive, right, at that level with those men. So there's
the gender
they don't need a
neutral
rule
league
against
exists, and it's usually
Right.
the men's league. So, but like trans women are not wanting to compete in that league, and I think it's weird to force leagues or sports organizations to affirm or buy into someone's gender identity. I don't think that's like the role of the state. And I think if a league wants to ban like trans women from competing with biological women, I think that's legitimate.
So, but my statement is not forcing anybody to do anything. It's just specifically saying like, hey, start different leagues. Maybe even there could even be like maybe like I don't know, maybe like in order to make the teams fair, like there needs to be X amount of X amount of women and X amount of men, regardless of like gender whatsoever. And as long as you're competing at this like top tier level, you're like good to go. Obviously there could be some issues that could end up being where these end up just being these leagues are just full of male assigned verse, and maybe have to go through HRT for X amount of time, which I thought was like 2 years or something like that. And you could correct me if I'm wrong, anybody on a panel, but I think there's like the advantage starts to decline after 2 years of HRT. I think I've heard that before.
It,
Is it fully
Dialogue,
gone?
dialogue always.
Mhm.
Where are you on this? You've been quiet for a long time. I've been watching you. I thought you were gonna do like a
Oh.
sniper move at some point, but the trigger never got pulled. So I'm pulling the trigger right now.
I mean, I would say probably solve this by, instead of calling a man, woman, which are gender terms, just call it male, female. That way it would be sex based. You can't really challenge it either way. I don't see it as forcing anybody to create a third league. I mean, if I don't see the problem in creating a third league just to eliminate all the issues that you would have. Um, I don't know why there's a pushback to that. I mean, it's just
Well,
giving them an opportunity to compete against
Dialogue.
themselves. They're not going to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to answer. I don't think there is any pushback. There is no pushback. I don't feel like that's anyone's contention, and I don't feel like that's the problem. I feel like everyone has said no one's ever said that can't be done. The problem is that it's being discussed as trans people participating in segregated sports. There's not an issue that we're saying there should be unsegregated sports. People could do that if they want. No one wants to do that.
Can I just also touch
always
on
been an
something
option.
really quick? And this is like, maybe someone can help solve this dilemma for me overall. Do you think that, like, by choosing to treat sports in this way, as a Texas law chooses to divide people, do you think that, like, removes chances for people to excel in certain sports?
No. What? Of course not.
Well, okay, so say you're a trans person that goes through HRT, you don't receive we're going to assume male to female, right? This person goes to HRT and doesn't receive it doesn't go through a male puberty, and they have to compete in a all male league. Don't you think that gives them essentially no ability to excel at that sport?
it blocks them out from engaging. But I also think that that's like that could be okay, right?
Yep.
Okay, I mean,
Does any
Like,
Does
yeah,
anyone
some
have, like-
people are going to be fucked a little bit, but
and I guess that's just my idea, right? Is that, like, if we're just simply going to be okay with just people
Sure.
just not being able to compete in a specific sport, then I mean,
Well,
I would say that's pretty.
is any
sorry.
person? Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. But
No, and I don't know if we can even curse here or not, but, like, just saying, it's,
No, you
like, it's pretty
can't.
messed up.
I mean, think
Yeah.
about it like this. Like, I am never going to be able to compete in the NBA because I don't have the natural athletic prowess or the height to do so, right? I don't think I'm discriminated against because I can't, like, excel or succeed in basketball. I don't think it's necessarily, like, the right of anyone to be matched up with people who, like, are their natural ability, therefore that they can exceed or
Agreed.
succeed. And moreover, I think that, like, there's an added layer of problematic issues here, which is that, like, not only are we asking to be matched up with, like, a very specific group that allows you to compete well, but you're also asking society to affirm your gender, which I think is what we talked about, maybe something that is, like, I don't think that, like, society should be forced to necessarily buy into your beliefs about yourself. If you believe that you're a woman and you want to present, wear clothes a certain way, change your name, I think that's all, like, First Amendment right. You can do that. That's presentation. You have liberty, whatever. But you can't force everyone to agree with you on that.
Yeah, and this
And
is
I-
exactly, issues like this are exactly why the trans topic comes up so much, right? Because there is a demand by a lot of these people, not all of them, but a lot of them, that society affirms the gender to and provides resources to them based on this gender that they wouldn't usually have access to, right? Or allows them to spaces they wouldn't usually have access to. But I think that that I don't know. I think I agree with April. You know, if there's, unfortunately, there's some mental and physical conditions that you could get as a human being that would make it very difficult for you to excel at sports, right? At any sports, right? So that's just an unfortunate reality. And I think it makes a lot more sense to accept that within this tiny percentage of people, there's an even smaller percentage who want to get into professional sports in this specific gender who cannot do it. That makes a lot more sense, just accepting that reality than attempting to upend the entire system within high school, at the professional level, to accommodate for this very, very small portion of people.
Yeah,
And
think
I
about
guess
like
something I want to.
Can I guess?
Oh,
I
yeah,
just say.
Yes, exactly.
I would just say in the same vein, there might be men or people born male and they've made other choices in their life, and maybe they're not able to compete at the at a competitive level, even in high school or college or something like that. That doesn't validate them, playing someone like Taftage was saying, like at their ability or their level. Like, well, they've made choices and now they can't compete at this level, so they get to play, or they can compete against people who are weaker than them. Like, no, that's not fair. Well, then they don't get to play, and it's like, well, then they should make different choices. Like if you eat a lot and you can't run, then that's going to be a problem, and so you can't compete. You don't get to craft opponents equal to your inability.
It's also
there's a huge blind spot in this, and actually April actually talked about this just very, very specifically, that and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing what you said, but you said there should be no real expectation for you to be mashed up against somebody who is of your same
gender.
Say specifically gender or specifically like physical ability.
Oh, both. I don't think that like
Okay.
you should necessarily like if you're a guy who, for example, let's say you have like intense autism, right? And it's like debilitating. I don't think that like then that means that like because you are competing at a lower level, you should like be matched up necessarily in like with like the women's league, right?
So there's a really big misstep in this, and this I feel like no one has touched on this. There is a sport in which you are expected to be matched up against someone who is of your same not political, same physical prowess. Which would be any type
Paralympics?
of like combat sports,
Yeah, like wrestling.
by weight.
specifically wrestling and boxing, right? Like by weight.
Mhm.
And then even there, even like at least in boxing, at least I understand, like even having like a specific like arm length can be an advantage to you when you're boxing with someone. So
Right.
if there is at least in some ways an expectation that there is a sport that allows you to compete with people who are of your same physical ability, it kind of feels like in that way, then why can't we just like try to figure out like where the physical abilities lie and then divide up by that way? And
Well,
That's what we did. It's called
No, but-
sex.
yeah, we've done that, and here's the thing. For those things don't undermine like the very obvious advantages and disadvantages that typically accompany people by sex. They just add an extra layer of also like of delineation, specifically because of the fact that there are other advantages even found within sexes that we feel like are too big to surmount, right? Or to overcome. So if we recognize that those same sort of advantages exist within the sexes, like largely, right, then it makes sense that we've already found it, right?
so if a male heavyweight decides that they want to box a like male welterweight, you understand that that's a significant disadvantage to the welterweight, correct?
And we wouldn't even let it happen. Yes.
Right.
Okay. Right. So, well,
I
then,
hate
so
to interject it, but there's
Go
an
ahead.
exact situation that's analogous to what you're trying to pose, right?
but
Do you know who Fallon Fox is?
I'm not familiar, but you can catch me up.
Fallon Fox is a transgender male who transitioned to being a woman and entered the UFC.
Okay.
Fallon Fox split somebody's head open.
Okay. Are there any other transgender people within the MMA?
I
No,
don't know.
after that incident, they didn't let that go down anymore.
Well, I mean, even before then.
They might have been the first. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I would have to look into it more. I would, if this is a specific case, maybe that's just not a sport that can realistically have those types of things. So maybe something like, I don't know, or like
And obviously powerlifting too, right?
Okay.
Like, maybe something. Yeah, maybe there are sports in which case this just literally reasonably cannot be something that can be like checked.
Yeah,
That can
like
be
tennis
Yeah.
and football
Yeah,
and
like-
basketball and baseball.
I mean,
I mean,
Low
what
end.
about?
Swimming.
I mean,
And swimming, like so. Listen, I don't want to
Sure.
be. I don't want to be a
archery,
douchebag.
shooting, there are like other things that are not specifically like that are have male and female leagues that really don't have to. And
I
maybe
mean, go ahead.
Like
and
Lowen,
again-
we just like went through all of like the major sports though, right? Like if all of them, baseball, football, powerlifting, wrestling, swimming, track and field, almost every sport that you can possibly think of, it affords insane amount of advantages. It seems like to males, and trans males tend to be going to these sports and doing really unfair thing to these women and literally taking their scholarships. So I think at this point, like every sport I can think of, it seems like this is the case. Can you name a sport? Because like I love the hypothetical fairyland of maybe there's a sport where it won't happen. What sport is that where there's not going to be an advantage given to males over women, over females?
Well, Fanatiq, I have to be fair, and since I gave that UFC option, I've talked about this at length. I can just throw in something random like croquet.
Esports.
Esports. There we go. And no, that's not even it either. Dude, so look, I'm sad. I really hate to say this, but like we've looked at esports for a long time. I had a professional like career in esports for like 10 years. For over 10 years actually. And so like if we look at it and we saw like that they had like males that almost every single competitor was a male, and then they finally had like a women's league, and then like there was a male to female trans. There's a male to female trans person who has been competing at these games for years, and that person was just like, I'm not even entering this. It's absolutely unfair to everyone else because there was literally zero competition. Like that is the only female to ever compete in the most popular games and win. It's not a thing, and I'm sorry. Like look at like League of Legends. It's not like there's a sex requirement for that. There are no women competing there. There was one woman, a trans woman, that was competing there.
The same
right?
thing sort of happens in like chess too. And like the way that like male ability or like competence intellectually or physically works is that the distribution is wider. So there's like more men who are like very smart and like very dumb than there are like, and the female distribution is like narrower. So a lot of like women tend to be closer in terms of like competency. And so when you look at like very high-end success, for example, like CEO positions or chess grandmasters, esports, etc. If you look at like any of these things, you'll expect to see like more men, but you also see more men in like prisons as well. And so it's not necessarily like the distribution is just wider, so it's not necessarily weird to see like more men in lots of these areas.
Yeah, and I can even agree with that. Like, I'm not trying to be like the only dissenting word here, but I just like if we're just like trying to just talk about the idea of just like fairness, if you guys are just okay with just certain people just not ever competing in sports, at least in a competitive manner, then I guess then there's no way that I can even like begin to like talk about this argument, because I would like people that if they want to play sports, like, and they want to be good at them and they put the work in, whatever, as long as like their advantage is not significant, I feel like they should be okay. And maybe unfortunately,
we agree
like,
there.
I mean,
we all agree
Sure,
to that
go
point.
ahead.
The point is that they all do have those advantages, and that's exactly where the problem lies.
but they don't. But it's not. They all have that advantage. It's
I'm
just
sorry,
that
the
it's more likely to the majority. It's more likely.
It's like-
let Brento in,
Can I-
and then I'm gonna
yeah.
try and move it to the next question because we're going somewhere where I have written down.
I just want to ask. I mean, it's like in the same way that we recognize an advantage of males over females in sports, we also recognize an advantage of like adults over children, right? So if an adult who maybe was really out of shape and they only had the physical capacity of a 10-year-old wanted to compete, we don't then let them compete against 10-year-olds because they are their physical equals. Right? We would not say like, oh, adults get like, well, they're about as strong as a 10-year-old, so now they're on the little league team. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even worse because like I think if you proved absolutely that like trans women are never statistically superior to cis women in any sports, like even if I just like grant that, I don't necessarily think that like leagues should be forced to have trans women and cis women on the
I'm
same
not
turn.
speaking specifically on forcing anybody to do anything. I'm just simply saying, like, hey, if we're going to make this distinction, then there should at least have people give the ability to compete at a competitive level, or are you just simply destining these people to never having a competitive edge at all in any sport that they compete in? And if that's what your position is, then I don't have an argument against that.
Yeah, I don't think you have like a fundamental right to like be participating in sports.
I'm not
with,
arguing
like,
for someone
women.
to have a right.
So can I give you
arguing?
Can I ask you a question? Because I mean, I'm sure you guys all know about like the Special Olympics, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Where
Paralympics.
so far as I know, like the high schools across this country, colleges across this country, not all of them are like required to have a Paralympics team or like a sports teams that cater specifically to this group of people who has different needs, right, than the norm, right? So like if we can acknowledge it's not a right for them, why would we say that it is a right for these people to the point where we need to create an entire new league to run alongside the existing leagues to accommodate them? Well, we know this is a very small percentage of people, first off. Right. And the amount of that small percentage who wants to do sports at the professional level is even smaller. Right. So it just seems, again, it seems much more reasonable to just accept the reality that there are certain mental and physical conditions that you could have as a human being that would eliminate your ability to compete at like high-end professional sports. Just accept that reality. That makes a lot more sense than overturning everything, fucking all of society to accommodate for this tiny group of people.
All right, guys.
I was
and
taking
this
the
is where
left
we're
wing
gonna there's
position
no
for,
fair
like,
way to do it, but this is where we're
the
gonna have to
previous
wrap it,
topic.
and we're just gonna end it with this here. Who is negatively affected, group or individual, by this legislation in Texas that is set up?
I mean, trans athletes who want to compete with women but are born male are going to have less ability.
Sure, I would agree with that statement, but then I would also add that like it's almost a necessary evil, because it's like if we don't do this, then that means that those same trans athletes are going to negatively impact women by competing and taking these scholarships and taking these records, and like causing other women not to even want to compete because they know that they can't
If
beat
you
them.
think IQ
So I
tests
feel
are
like
racist because they were designed by
they're
white people,
by the legislation
I
itself,
think you're going to
like
have a
the
lot of
people
problem
who
with
want to take
most
these
technology in society.
opportunities away from women are hurt.
And I actually I agree with both of you guys, and I appreciate that you at least like put on. You said, Fanatic, yourself, that it's a necessary evil, because I think that ultimately it's kind of not. It's not really not a great thing to do to just simply say like, hey, you can't compete, and it's just because that's essentially where it comes down to. But if we're okay with that, then there's no other discussion to be had.
Well, because I want to make sure, because you've made that statement quite a few times, and it seems like a really disingenuous framing, and I wasn't sure that you were doing that. So let's just make sure that this is clear. You do understand by not doing this evil, we're doing a great evil to women. Would you concede that?
But my solution to it was to simply just make a specific league specific to these particular people. They don't have to compete in the women's league. They don't even have to be.
That's not
very
the
strong.
That's not
solution.
viable.
That's
number
what's
one.
happening. That's not
A
what's
lot of
being
the
asked.
studies
That's
are
Not
not
only
what's
is that
being
pretty
put
bad.
forward.
That's not what's being put forward, and that's not a solution, because there's not enough trans athletes to actually constitute an entire league. So now you end up having these districts where you
And
have
even
literally
when
three
you have
people competing
studies,
against
one
each
second.
other, right?
Yeah.
And like that's it, right? Because there's not enough trans.
Even when you do have studies that show Black people have lower IQ than white people, well, not only is it weaker, it's not very strong evidence, but a lot of times it doesn't even show that it's genetically related, right? There's like IQ is highly influenced by environment. So
then it's like, no, we're saying that that's not fair, and we want to make sure that we protect people like in general. And it's unfair to like literally upend the entire system that has been designed to be fair for the for like literally over, and I'm not exaggerating, over 99% of competitors. If we're going to upend that system to say no, but this 1% of competitors now won't be, or the 1% of would-be competitors want to come up in that system, and we're saying no, we're going to gatekeep that. I think that's absolutely a necessary good. I'm taking back the evil, because it seems like you're trying to gain some purchase with that, and I'm taking that back. It's a necessary benefit, it's a necessary good, and it's our actual societal duty to protect women in that way. And
then if I could try and do my best to make a bridge here, because I think I can take out good and evil and say this. Somebody is going to be negatively affected and somebody is going to be positively affected. Correct?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So just based on that, on the reasoning that you guys have had all throughout this conversation, the left side of the panel would have to go with women are going to be positively affected, and we're not sorry about it. The trans community will be negatively affected. That's where the pie has to be cut, and you guys would say the same. You guys would say the same thing, but you would just have party would have their own emotional leaning towards the other. But we cannot factor that in, right? That's fair.
Sure.
Yeah,
Everybody,
yeah, I think so.
everybody good with that?
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. And that's why I am the best mod on Twitch, ladies and gentlemen. Everything that they said on Twitter with that whole picture where they had people that I didn't even know, honestly, that guy in the bottom middle, who is that guy, right? That should have been my spot, honestly. But I digress.
That other video was pretty bad, man. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know that was pretty bad. Sometimes, bro, you guys say some wild stuff, and it's like, the mod hat has to come off. I'm not perfect. I have my flaws, but yeah, thank you everyone out there for coming to the channel and witnessing this debate that took place. This was a nice panel. This was cordial. I think it was very productive. Taftage,
Yes.
first one to shout yourself out on your channel. Tell them where they can find you.
Yeah, follow me, Taftage.
You're muted.
Am I muted?
Everything you said was lost.
I was yelling at my chat. Sorry. We've got intense debates about the validity of IQ tests. But yeah, follow me, Taftaj, TAFTAJ, on Twitter, on Twitch. Twitter's pretty NSFW right now, more than usual. So be warned. But yeah, follow me on Twitch if you want more political conversations.
Awesome. And then Brento Box.
Hey.
Please show us that awesome dog one more time and tell us where we can find you before we get out of here.
Yeah, totally. You guys can find me at Twitch TV/BrentoBox when I'm streaming. And I'm usually on other people's panels on Discords. I'm usually on Prime's panel some nights, usually maybe 1 or 2 nights a week, talking about something. This is Maggie.
Oh, Maggie.
And yeah, she's great. And
We'll come
that's
to your channel for Maggie.
from shit. Yeah, pretty much. That's the best reason to come. Yeah.
Gotcha. Dialogue always. You want to shout yourself out where everybody can find you?
I just have a Twitter, Dialogue Always. That's pretty much it. You can find me there.
Awesome. High octane ending. I love it. Doobie, tell us where we can find you.
That is the Politics Discord server, discord.gg/politics. We had an AMA with David Pakman yesterday. On Wednesday of next week, we're having one with one of my heroes, actually, Daryl Davis. I literally love this guy. So if you want to be there, Wednesday next week, we're working on setting a specific time, but that's where it'll be.
Perfect. Low end.
So right now, you can find me just on Twitter right now. I think it's DLowEndTheory right now. That's my Twitter handle. And yeah, that's pretty much it right now until I start doing YouTube content.
Awesome. And my name is Pedro. I am the co-owner of The Crucible. You can come and watch all of our debates there on that YouTube, Twitch channel. We are everywhere, really. This is my Twitter handle. If you want to see what kind of crazy stuff that I talk about all the time, you're probably not going to like my takes at all. And this is Fanatiq's panel that I am so honored to be a part of now, and I'll be help modding him hopefully on a regular basis if he doesn't fire me for co-promoting my channel on here. But yes, sir. Fanatiq, you want to take us away?
Yeah, absolutely. I sincerely appreciate all of you guys for coming in for the conversation. This is the Fanatiq Show and the Fanatiq panel, and the whole purpose of this thing is to do dialogue. It's not supposed to be spicy. I have a hard time not being spicy. I definitely messaged Pedro midway through the conversation. Was like, hey, you can't let me get spicy like that. I'm getting frustrated. And I do know that I tend to get really amped, but ultimately I do love the conversation and I want the conversation to be preeminent. I'm sorry for kind of getting a little bit more cantankerous. It's a really, really hard thing to root out, especially when I'm emotionally involved, which is why it's so much easier to be a moderator. Pedro and I will be kind of switching off, sometimes being moderator, sometimes he'll be the guest and so on and so forth. I think he did a fantastic job. You can follow me at twitch.tv/Mr. Fanatiq. YouTube is Ask Fanatiq because some I want to call them the N-word, but since I'm live, I won't actually give up that name, and that account isn't even being used, so I can't get it. You can follow me on my music, because I am actually a particularly skilled professional musician. That's how I make a living. You can check me out playing the piano there sometimes at twitch.tv/Mr. But you can find all of my music under the name Fanatiq, Fanatiq, on every platform. Napster. Didn't know that still existed, did you? Tidal. Freaking Spotify, Amazon Music, so on and so forth. I just came out with an album last Friday called Pneumatic, Pneumatiq. It is a piano album that you can check out. I think it's particularly fantastic. It's my favorite album. It's my third studio album that I've ever released. Please check that out. Hopefully some of you guys who are present for this panel will stream the music, because it's all DMCA and DRM free, so you can play it on your streams with no ramifications or repercussions. I hope you guys can check that stuff out.
Box.
And yeah, we'll be here next week.
He's attractive.
Guys, we didn't curse once. No one cursed.
Really?
Can you believe that? Dude,
That's
yes. I was waiting for it.
Huh.
It never happened.
I never do.
I try not to curse.
Yeah,
I got close once.
Yeah, you almost said the F word. I heard it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I almost feel like April might have cursed once.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I didn't sense it. But
Yeah,
dude,
I
I
try
think I
not
might
to,
heard it
but
once.
it's possible.
yeah,
Yeah.
strong character. Cursing is a sign of a weakness of mental fortitude and character, ladies and gentlemen.
I've heard that.
Oh, no, that's not true. I love
me-
cursing.
Let me ask you guys this really quick. Before you
Don't
guys
ruin it,
leave,
Crypto
though.
Box. That was a wise moment.
Before you guys leave, do you guys feel like the dialogue was missing something? Or do you feel like, obviously it's not like we got to a hard resolution of this is right or this is wrong, but do you guys feel like overall the dialogue was kind of important, and that you were able to express yourselves, and the idea was fully kind of fleshed out, at least to some degree?
I feel extremely happy that I was able to move you at least a little bit, and hopefully make people just, I don't know, question their positions a little bit. If I can do that, I think I'm totally happy with how it went.
That's fair.
Yeah, had a good time.
Okay. Well, this is a successful panel. Thank you so much, Pedro. You did a really, really great job. I sincerely appreciate you,
this.
fam. Legit. All right, you guys. I'll catch you guys later. I'm gonna go ahead and
All
stream
right.
some Lost Ark because I'm addicted.
Nice.
Gotcha. Take it
Alright,
easy, everyone.
bye, guys.
See ya.
Good stuff, everybody. Good stuff. I am going to close out the stream. It's been fun. I love you all.